Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. The Caves of Santa Fe. I'd spent years studying ancient cultures, their symbols, and the art they left behind. As a hiker and researcher, there was always a drive inside me to uncover the forgotten stories of the past. I had seen my share of mysterious places, caves in the hills of Europe, ruins lost in jungles, but the Caves of Santa Fe had always intrigued me the most. Located in the deserts of New Mexico, the caves were rumored to hold ancient drawings and symbols untouched by time. The kind of hidden knowledge that could only be found where the earth had kept its secrets for centuries. This wasn't my first solo expedition, but there was something about this particular place that felt different. The weathered roads, the barren desert stretched out in every direction, and the oppressive silence of the land. There were rumors, of course, legends about strange occurrences, missing hikers, whispers of ancient spirits, but I wasn't one to give in to superstition. My focus was clear: the drawings. The cave paintings and carvings left by Native American cultures long before the Spanish arrived in the region. Those symbols held secrets, and it was my job to uncover them. As I parked my truck at the base of the trail, I noticed the wind had picked up, stirring the dust around me in swirling gusts. My pack, already loaded with water, maps, and tools for exploration, felt heavier than usual. The silence, once peaceful, now felt unsettling. I couldn't place it. Maybe it was the vast emptiness that surrounded the cave entrance, or perhaps the way the sun beat down, creating long, stretching shadows. I adjusted the straps of my backpack and took one last glance at the horizon before beginning my ascent toward the cave. "I've done this hundreds of times before," I muttered under my breath, trying to reassure myself. But there was a strange weight to the air as I moved deeper into the desert. The path to the caves was warm, but not heavily trafficked. It was clear that most people didn't venture out here, especially alone. As I walked, the desert landscape shifted around me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd been in remote places before, and the isolation was always humbling, but this time it was different. There was something intangible, something beneath the surface, like a hidden presence I couldn't fully comprehend. Finally, I arrived at the cave's mouth. The entrance was large, the jagged rock formations towering above me like dark sentinels. The shadows within the cave felt thick, almost like they were swallowing the light, and for the first time, a thought flickered in my mind: what if the stories were true? I shook the thought away. This was what I came for, a chance to connect with history, to unravel mysteries left long ago by those who came before. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the cool darkness of the cave, my flashlight illuminating only a small portion of the stone before me. The air grew colder as I walked further in, and the faintest echo of my footsteps bounced back to me. "This is it," I whispered to myself, pushing the unease aside. "Let's see what secrets you're hiding." The desert in New Mexico was a world unto itself, vast, empty, and unforgiving. The sun hung like a burning eye in the sky, casting long shadows across the sand and rock. My boots crunched against the dry, cracked earth as I moved forward, each step carrying me further away from civilization and into the unknown. The air was thick with heat, but the wind picked up occasionally, sweeping dust and sand into the air, a reminder of how wild this place could be. As the trail twisted and wound through the desolate landscape, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of isolation. The world seemed so still, so far away, and for the first time, I felt the weight of my solitude pressing against me. No cars, no other hikers, no signs of life. Just me and the land, stretching out endlessly in all directions. I stopped for a moment to take in the vastness of it all, the arid desert stretching out beneath a cloudless sky. The silence was profound, almost oppressive. It wasn't the usual quiet of a wilderness, where the hum of insects or the rustle of wind through trees would break the stillness. Here, there was nothing but the slow, heavy pulse of the land, as though it was holding its breath, waiting. It was the kind of place that could make you feel very small if you let it. But I didn't let it. I had a purpose here, a mission. I wasn't some wanderer lost in the desert. I was a researcher, someone who had studied this land, these people, these caves. I had come for answers, to unlock the mysteries hidden within the earth. So, I kept moving. One step after another, the dry earth cracking beneath my boots as I followed the path that led to the caves. The further I walked, the more I began to sense that there was something different about this place. It was subtle at first, just the faintest change in the air, a shift in the way the wind blew. But there it was, gnawing at the back of my mind. A feeling of being watched, of not being alone. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. Just the trail I'd left behind, fading into the distance. The feeling didn't go away, though. It lingered like a shadow, something that couldn't be touched or seen, but could be felt, just out of reach. Just the isolation getting to me, I muttered to myself, brushing it off. No one's out here but me. It made sense. A place like this, so remote, so untouched by human hands for centuries, how could anyone not feel the weight of its isolation? The desert had always been a place of solitude, where the wind whispered its secrets through the rocks, and the land itself seemed to hold its breath in the heat of the sun. But I wasn't afraid. I'd been to many remote places in my life, all over the world. I knew how to handle myself in situations like this. The unease I felt was just a part of the experience, nothing more. I pressed on, the cave's entrance growing larger ahead, the rocky formations rising like sentinels from the earth. The wind had picked up again, carrying with it the faintest scent of something earthy. Almost like damp stone, or the smell of ancient wood rotting in the sun. I frowned at the thought and quickened my pace. The sooner I got into the cool shade of the caves, the better. As I neared the mouth of the cave, the temperature dropped suddenly, and the air became still, heavy. The change was so immediate that it caught me off guard. One moment, the heat of the desert pressed against me, and the next, a chill that felt unnatural surrounded me. I shivered, despite the warmth of the sun still beating down outside. Stepping into the darkness of the cave felt like stepping into another world entirely. The air was cool, damp, and smelled faintly of earth, stone, and something else I couldn't quite place. It was quiet, too quiet. The echoes of my footsteps seemed to disappear the moment they left my boots, swallowed by the darkness that stretched ahead. I hesitated for a brief moment, taking one last look at the desert outside. The sense of isolation was stronger now, more pressing, and for a fleeting second, I wondered if this was a mistake. But then I shook the thought away. I wasn't afraid of the dark, or of being alone. I had come here for a reason, and I wasn't going to back down now. With a deep breath, I stepped into the cave, the darkness closing in around me. The mouth of the cave loomed before me, its jagged edges cutting into the sky like the teeth of some ancient, forgotten creature. The opening seemed small at first, almost unassuming, but as I drew closer, the darkness inside began to swallow everything around it. I stopped a few feet from the entrance, taking a moment to adjust to the sudden change in temperature. The air outside was dry and blistering, but inside, it felt almost like stepping into a forgotten tomb. I took a slow, deliberate breath, noticing how the air had shifted from the dry, desert heat to something cooler, almost damp. It wasn't just the absence of heat, it was like the air had taken on weight, a thickness that pressed against my chest as I stepped closer. The sudden contrast felt jarring, unnatural even, but I told myself it was just the natural fluctuation between the outside desert and the cave's interior. It wasn't unusual for temperature changes to occur when you entered such places. Yet, something felt off. The air wasn't just cooler, it was heavier, as if it had been sitting there for centuries, untouched, waiting. I shook the feeling off, stepping forward with more purpose. The sensation of unease flickered, but I brushed it aside. After all, I'd prepared for this. I'd studied the cave's formation and its geological properties. Nothing here could surprise me, not really. I crouched down to adjust my backpack, my fingers brushing against the straps as I secured everything more tightly. The eerie chill seemed to sink into my bones, and I instinctively glanced over my shoulder. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving out there in the desert, just on the edge of my vision. But when I turned fully, nothing was there. The barren landscape stretched endlessly before me, silent as ever. I had to be imagining things. It had been a long hike, and the isolation was starting to get to me. That's all it was. Just the quiet desert playing tricks on my mind. I pulled the flashlight from my pack, the beam cutting through the darkness just as I stepped inside. The beam of light bounced off the stone walls, revealing smooth, polished surfaces and ancient carvings that seemed to pulse ever so slightly in the dim glow. The chill seemed to deepen the further I went, but it didn't worry me. It was just the cave's natural atmosphere, I reasoned. I had come here to explore, not to be scared by every little shift in the environment. I pushed forward, my footsteps echoing through the vast emptiness of the cave. The path inside was wide at first, the floor uneven with rocks and debris scattered in every direction. The air grew even cooler, and the sense of isolation, of being completely alone, seemed more pronounced. But I couldn't afford to be distracted by these feelings. There was work to be done. Yet, as I moved further in, the change in atmosphere seemed to grow more pronounced. It wasn't just the temperature anymore. The air itself seemed different. Almost thick, like the cave was holding its breath. I paused, listening. There was no wind now, no sounds of the outside world. The silence was deep, absolute. Even the usual echoes that came with movement in a cave were strangely muted. I turned on my flashlight, inspecting the walls around me more closely. The deeper I went, the more the shadows seemed to stretch, warping as the light flickered. It was a subtle thing at first, a dark corner of the cave where the light seemed to distort, a shifting shape just at the edge of my vision. But when I turned my head quickly to catch it, it was gone. I stared into the darkness, trying to push the thoughts of shadows playing tricks on me out of my mind. I let out a quiet exhale, steadying myself. "It's nothing," I muttered aloud. "Just your mind playing games. You're fine." Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The air had shifted again, becoming more oppressive. My breath quickened, and a shiver ran down my spine. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the drawings that adorned the walls, symbols that had drawn me here in the first place. They were beautiful, intricate. The mysterious work of people who had walked these lands long before me. But as I moved further, the air seemed to grow heavier with each step, pressing on me, tugging at my chest. The darkness of the cave felt more alive now, wrapping itself around me like a second skin. I stopped again, my flashlight beam flickering for just a second. It wasn't enough to alarm me, but it was enough to make me pause. I looked back toward the entrance, barely visible now in the distance. The light from the outside world seemed far, far away, the brightness swallowed up by the overwhelming blackness of the cave. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, but I refused to acknowledge it. I turned my back on the entrance, focusing again on the path ahead. The sound of my footsteps reverberated off the walls, creating an almost hollow echo. The further I went, the more it felt like I was stepping into something that wanted to keep me inside, something that had always been there. But I was a researcher, a seeker of truth. I couldn't let irrational fear dictate my actions. Pushing forward, I reminded myself once more that this was nothing more than the cave itself, the natural environment playing tricks on my senses. Still, the weight of the air lingered. The deeper I ventured into the cave, the more oppressive the air became. The temperature was dropping steadily, though I had expected this. What I hadn't expected, however, was the feeling of the cave itself shifting around me. The darkness here wasn't just an absence of light, it felt like a living presence, an entity that was watching, waiting. But I pressed forward, determined to complete the task I had come for. As I moved deeper, the walls began to reveal their secrets. At first, they were just rough stone, the rock chiseled by time, worn smooth in places where water had once flowed through. But then, as my flashlight danced across the walls, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. Strange symbols, etched into the stone, were scattered across the cave's interior. They were unlike anything I had seen before, complex, spiraling patterns, some resembling ancient scripts, others more abstract. At first glance, they seemed to be nothing more than simple carvings, but as I moved closer, something about them caught my eye. The light from my flashlight seemed to make them shimmer, shifting just slightly as though they were alive. I couldn't help but lean in closer, tracing the shapes with my eyes. The symbols were more than mere decorations. They felt important, almost as though they were calling to me, urging me to understand them. Some of them were large, sweeping across entire sections of the walls, while others were tiny, hidden in small recesses, only visible if you knew where to look. There was one symbol in particular that drew me in. It was a large spiral, intricately carved, that seemed to twist and turn on itself, weaving through the stone. As the beam of my flashlight moved across it, I could have sworn the lines shimmered, bending and undulating in ways that weren't quite natural. The longer I stared at it, the more it seemed to move, as though the stone itself was breathing with every flicker of light. A chill ran down my spine, but I shook it off. I was a researcher, after all. The brain has a way of playing tricks on you in the dark. Perhaps it was just the way the light hit the carvings, casting shifting shadows that gave the illusion of movement. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and pulled out my notebook. "Just focus," I muttered aloud, flipping open the pages. "This is what you came for." I began to sketch the symbol in my notebook, trying to capture its essence as best as I could. The spiral was unlike anything I had studied before. It felt ancient, primal, like it held some kind of power, or perhaps a warning. I couldn't help but feel the pull of it, urging me to look deeper, to uncover whatever secret it was trying to communicate. But as I sketched, the air around me seemed to shift again, growing colder. I looked up, my eyes scanning the walls for more signs, more drawings, more clues. And that's when I saw it, a figure etched into the rock, so faint it was almost imperceptible. It wasn't a symbol at all. It was a shape, a form of something I couldn't quite make out. As I directed my flashlight toward it, the shape seemed to flicker, as if it were moving just out of my reach. It was humanoid in shape, but the lines were jagged, warped, like a creature that didn't belong. The more I stared at it, the more it seemed to change. Its limbs stretched, then curled back in on themselves, the features of its face shifting, its eyes dark and unblinking. I blinked, and the image was gone. No, it wasn't gone. It had simply shifted. It was still there, waiting, but now it was just a shadow on the wall, a smear of ink that had somehow been captured in the stone. I took a step back, my heart beginning to race as I felt an uncomfortable tightness in my chest. There was something terribly wrong here. Something ancient, something that had been waiting for someone to come, someone to look too closely. I swung my flashlight back to the symbol I had been sketching earlier, but now it looked different. The spiral had become tighter, more condensed. The lines no longer shimmered, they pulsed, faintly, as if alive. It was no longer just a drawing on the wall. It felt like it was part of something larger, something that existed beyond the physical world. I could feel the weight of the cave pressing in on me, its walls closing in with every breath I took. The oppressive silence seemed to deepen, filling the air with an unnatural stillness. And in that stillness, I heard it, a faint whisper, just barely audible, like the rustling of wind through the rocks. But there was no wind here. I was alone. I shook my head, my mind racing. I was losing focus. The cave was playing tricks on me. These symbols, these drawings, they were just old carvings, nothing more. I had to stay calm. I had to keep my mind sharp. But as I stepped further into the depths of the cave, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something that had been waiting here long before I ever set foot inside. And the deeper I went, the more I felt like I was walking into something that had never meant to be discovered. Something that was now aware of my presence. The deeper I ventured, the more the cave seemed to press in on me. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone, a smell that lingered in my nostrils, unsettling and heavy. My flashlight beam flickered as I adjusted its angle, casting strange, elongated shadows across the walls, twisting the already distorted carvings into something even more sinister. It was easy to get lost in the cave's vastness, each turn and passageway blending into the next, creating an endless labyrinth of darkness. I pushed forward, determined to continue my exploration despite the creeping unease that had settled in my gut. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the environment, the silence pressing in on me, but with each step, I became more aware of the growing tension. It wasn't just the temperature or the shadows on the walls anymore. There was something in the air, something that felt alive. And then, just as I reached a narrow passageway that seemed to dip downward, I heard it. At first, it was so faint I almost thought I had imagined it. A rustling sound, distant but unmistakable, like dry leaves being stirred by the wind, or perhaps the soft shuffle of footsteps across stone. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I strained my ears, listening. The sound came again, this time louder, more distinct. It wasn't wind, it wasn't the soft scrape of my boots against the rocky ground. No, this was something else entirely. The sound of something moving, something that wasn't me. My flashlight swung wildly in the direction of the noise, but the beam only revealed the same dark, empty passage ahead, stretching out into the depths of the cave. I exhaled sharply, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread creeping up my spine. It's just the cave settling, I muttered to myself. Nothing more. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, pushing forward, my boots scraping against the stone as I descended further. But the sound persisted. Faint at first, like the rustling of fabric brushing against rock, then unmistakable footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human. My pulse quickened. I stopped in my tracks, my mind racing. I knew I wasn't alone anymore. For a moment, I simply stood there, frozen in place, listening to the sounds reverberating through the tunnels. The footsteps, or whatever they were, seemed distant but undeniably close. It was impossible to gauge their exact source, the echoes bouncing off the cave walls in all directions. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. There was no way anyone else was here. No one had hiked this far out into the desert with me. I had checked the trail, no sign of any other explorers. I had been completely alone when I arrived, and I had seen no one for miles. And yet, there it was again. A faint rustling, the soft shuffle of footsteps moving through the darkness. It wasn't just in my head. It was real. A wave of coldness washed over me, settling deep in my bones. I stepped backward, my eyes darting around the tunnel as I tried to locate the source of the sound. The shadows seemed to shift with every flicker of the flashlight, but nothing moved in the beam's glow. "Hello?" I called out, my voice hoarse, echoing unnaturally through the cave. There was no response. Only silence. I waited for a moment, listening for any answer, any clue as to what was happening. But the only thing I heard was my own breathing, ragged and shallow. The rustling had stopped. The footsteps, too, had disappeared, if they had ever been there in the first place. I strained my ears, hoping to hear them again, but the cave remained still, as though it had never been disturbed. But I knew better than to trust the silence. There was something down here. Something that had been hiding in the darkness, just beyond my reach. And the longer I stood there, the more I felt the walls closing in on me, the cave pressing tighter around me as if it were waiting for something. The strange, creeping sensation of being watched returned, stronger now than ever before. It wasn't just the chill in the air, or the fleeting, unsettling sound of footsteps. It was the feeling that something unseen was moving just out of sight, something that could see me, could feel me, something ancient, something that knew I was here. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. There was no reason to be afraid. There was no one else in the cave with me. It was just my mind playing tricks, the isolation amplifying every little noise. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The cave was no longer just a cold, silent structure. It had become aware of me. And it wasn't welcoming. I gripped my flashlight tighter and continued down the narrow path, my steps quicker now, as though the darkness behind me were gaining on me. The sense of urgency built inside me, an instinctual pull to get deeper into the cave, to find what was hidden, what I had come for. But the question lingered at the back of my mind as I moved further into the depths. What was really in here with me? The path ahead twisted and turned, narrowing in places where the rocks seemed to squeeze the air out of the cave. My flashlight cut through the shadows, illuminating the jagged walls that stretched upward into the dark, disappearing into an impenetrable blackness. Despite the growing sense of discomfort gnawing at the back of my mind, I pressed on. The deeper I went, the harder it was to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the footsteps I had heard earlier, or thought I had heard. It was something more primal, something that seemed to have seeped into the very air of this place. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was hungry, filled with the unspoken weight of something ancient and forgotten. And the cave itself, with its endless twisting corridors, felt like it was alive, growing, shifting, and moving, as if it were trying to swallow me whole. I couldn't explain it, but as I walked, the sensation of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't just my imagination. Every step I took felt more noticed, like the walls themselves were judging me. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the growing unease. "Focus," I muttered under my breath. "Focus on the task." I pulled out my notebook again, scribbling some observations. The symbols I had discovered earlier, those spiraling, abstract shapes, seemed to repeat the deeper I went. But they were changing, too. Where they had been simple, almost geometric at first, they had begun to take on more detailed, intricate forms. The lines curved and wove in and out of each other, becoming almost hypnotic as they spiraled across the walls in dizzying patterns. Some seemed familiar, shapes I recognized from ancient cultures, but others were alien, unfathomable. My flashlight caught on a particularly large symbol, its spiral pattern spread across an entire wall. This one seemed different from the others, more alive. I stepped closer, unable to tear my gaze away from the twisting lines. The light from my flashlight made the edges of the spiral glow faintly, like it was shimmering, pulsing with some unseen energy. It was as if the drawing was reaching out, beckoning me to understand it, to decipher its meaning. But the more I looked, the more the lines blurred, shifting in ways that made me dizzy. I blinked hard, trying to focus. And then I saw it. A figure, just a shadow at first, was emerging from the pattern. It wasn't fully formed, not yet, but it was there. A shape, moving ever so slightly within the symbols, as though it had always been hidden within the drawing, waiting for someone to look closely enough to notice. The figure was humanoid, but its features were grotesque, distorted. Its limbs elongated unnaturally, and its face, if it could be called a face, was a hollow, empty space. It had no eyes, no mouth, only a dark void where a face should have been. I took an instinctive step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The air around me seemed to grow thicker, heavier, suffocating. The oppressive silence of the cave was deafening now, filled only by the sound of my own breathing. But then, as if to mock my fear, the figure shifted, its form flickering and warping as though the shadows themselves were playing tricks on my mind. I quickly averted my gaze, blinking repeatedly. But when I looked back, the figure was gone, leaving only the intricate, twisting symbols in its place. I swallowed hard, fighting to keep my composure. There was no way that was real. It had to be my mind playing tricks on me. The darkness, the isolation, it was all making me see things, forcing my brain to conjure up shapes and figures where there were none. I was being irrational, paranoid. I had to focus on the task at hand. Taking a deep breath, I shook my head and continued down the narrow passage. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cave was closing in on me, the walls pressing tighter with every step. The deeper I went, the more the drawings seemed to change, evolving from abstract lines to more detailed, more vivid depictions. There was something unsettling about them. The figures in the drawings now looked like people, humans, but not quite. Their faces were distorted, their bodies twisted in unnatural ways. Some were crouching, some were reaching out with elongated arms, their eyes wide and empty. The faces of the figures weren't human, they were twisted, their mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide in terror. The drawings didn't just decorate the walls, they followed me. I could feel their eyes on me, their stares cold and unblinking, no matter how quickly I moved. I forced myself to look away from the figures, trying to focus on the task at hand, trying to remind myself that I was here to study, to uncover the meaning behind these markings. But the more I looked at them, the the more I felt something rising in the pit of my stomach, a sense of foreboding, as though I had trespassed too far, as though I had crossed into a place where I didn't belong. The sense of unease grew, the weight of the cave's silence pressing down on me. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing in the shadows, watching me. But the tunnel behind me was empty, just as I had left it. The footsteps, the rustling, had disappeared as quickly as they had come, leaving only the unsettling silence of the cave to fill the void. But even though I couldn't hear anything, I could still feel it, the presence that was there, just out of sight. Something was following me. Something was waiting. The drawings, the figures, they weren't just decorations. They were warnings. And the deeper I went, the more I realized that this cave, this place, wasn't just an archaeological site. It was a tomb for something ancient. Something that had been buried for a reason. And it was waiting for me. I continued my descent into the cave, determined to ignore the creeping feeling that was growing stronger with every step. The passage ahead narrowed again, the walls closing in as the tunnel twisted to the left. The light from my flashlight flickered, casting an eerie, wavering glow across the uneven stone floor. I could hear the sound of my own footsteps echoing back to me, amplified by the narrow space. But there was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the usual echo, the way sounds bounce off the cave walls, distorting their origin. It was different. The sound of my boots scraping against the stone seemed to stretch unnaturally, the rhythm off, almost too perfect. As I walked, the echoes seemed to mock me, repeating a second too late, or sometimes too soon. It wasn't just a faint reflection, it was almost like another pair of footsteps were following mine, mimicking every movement. Step. 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 I halted mid-stride, my heart suddenly hammering in my chest. My breath hitched as I listened carefully. Step. 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 I wasn't imagining it. The sound was too deliberate, too precise. I could hear the echo of my own footsteps, but there was another. Another set of steps, slow, methodical, as if it were walking in sync with me. My mind raced, scrambling for a logical explanation. Maybe it was the acoustics of the cave, some odd phenomenon that distorted the sounds. Maybe my hearing was playing tricks on me, the isolation making my senses unreliable. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the case. I wasn't just hearing echoes, I was hearing something else entirely. Something was down here with me. I took a step forward, forcing my feet to move, as though by continuing, I could outrun the growing panic in my chest. The footsteps followed. Exactly the same rhythm, as if someone, or something, was pacing me, mirroring my every move. A part of me screamed to stop, to turn back, but another part, the part that thrived on discovery, on solving the puzzle, pushed me forward. I quickened my pace, hoping that by moving faster, I could outrun the sound. But the footsteps only grew more insistent. It was as if they were matching my speed. The faster I went, the closer they seemed. They were too perfect. Too precise. Step. 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 I stopped again, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The light swung wildly, casting shadows that seemed to flicker and move of their own accord. The narrow tunnel before me stretched into darkness, but in the dim glow of my flashlight, I swore I saw something shift at the edge of the beam. A shadow, a shape, moving just beyond the reach of the light. I swung the flashlight back to where I had thought I'd seen it, but there was nothing. Only the walls. The same cold, unyielding stone. Yet the air felt different now. It felt thick, as though it was pressing in on me. I wasn't alone. I knew I wasn't. I tried to steady my breathing, trying to calm myself. It's just my mind, I muttered to myself. It's the isolation, the darkness, it's making me paranoid. But the footsteps wouldn't stop. They were still there, keeping pace with me, like a shadow that refused to leave. I turned sharply, my flashlight illuminating the passage behind me, but again, there was nothing. The cave was empty. Still. Silent. I frowned, confused, disoriented. There had been something there, I was sure of it. I had seen movement, or at least thought I had. I took a deep breath, my pulse pounding in my ears, and decided to press on. I would just continue walking. It was the only way to escape the suffocating tension. I turned back around, but the sound of the footsteps, the echo, was still there. They hadn't stopped. They never stopped. Step. 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 The pattern of the footsteps began to change. Instead of mimicking my every movement, they began to break apart, speeding up, overlapping with my own. I heard my own footfalls and then another set of feet, louder now, almost too close. The sound was growing more erratic, as if something was pacing with me, its steps no longer in perfect synchrony with mine, but out of phase, overlapping and disturbing. I froze. I was no longer alone. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, settled over me, a heavy weight that pushed down on my chest. I could almost hear the presence in the shadows, moving just out of sight, mimicking me, mocking me, but never revealing itself. My mind raced for answers, anything to explain this. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, but the footsteps were too deliberate. Too human. Or at least, they sounded like human footsteps. And animals, they didn't move like this. They didn't follow you, step by step. I tried to tell myself it was just the cave playing tricks on me, that the acoustics were warping everything I heard. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the stronger the sense of wrongness grew. The echo wasn't just an illusion, it was something far more sinister. Something deliberate. Something that knew I was here and was waiting for me to make the wrong move. I gripped the flashlight harder, feeling the sweat bead on my brow despite the cool air. The sound of the footsteps continued, drawing closer, faster. I needed to find a way out. I needed to escape. But where? The cave stretched endlessly before me, each turn and passageway leading further into the darkness. And the footsteps, they were closing in. Step. 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 But this time, I didn't turn to look. I couldn't. The air in the cave had changed. It was colder now, heavier, and it felt like the darkness itself was pressing against my skin. I had kept moving, hoping the unsettling feeling would pass, that the footsteps would stop, but they never did. They were always there, in the periphery of my awareness, just beyond my reach, as if something was following me, mimicking my movements. Every step I took seemed to trigger another echo, just behind me, in sync with my own. And then there was that feeling. That horrible feeling. I wasn't alone. I knew it. I could feel it, like I was watching me from the darkness, like something was standing just out of sight, waiting. I forced myself to keep moving, my flashlight darting over the jagged walls. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Just my imagination. The cave was playing tricks on me. The isolation, the darkness, it was getting to me. but the sensation grew stronger, more undeniable. Every time I stopped, I felt the weight of something behind me, something unseen, pressing into my back, as if it were waiting for me to make the mistake of turning around. I couldn't explain it, but the longer I stood still, the more intense the sensation became. I stopped and exhaled sharply, my breath catching in my throat. My pulse quickened. I turned quickly, scanning the cave, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was there. There was nothing. Just the walls. The endless, unchanging walls of the cave. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing, my heartbeat thundering in my chest. The silence of the cave was overwhelming. Every tiny sound, every breath, every rustle of my clothing seemed magnified in the stillness, the echoes bouncing off the walls and amplifying, adding to the growing pressure in my chest. Focus, I told myself. You're just imagining things. But then I saw it, just for a split second. Out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement. A shadow, no, not a shadow, a shape, a figure, just at the edge of my light. My heart skipped a beat, and I whipped my flashlight toward it. The beam of light danced across the walls, casting long, twitching shadows, but there was nothing. I paused, staring into the darkness, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. The air had gotten colder, and I could feel the weight of something, or someone, right behind me, like it was breathing down my neck. I turned slowly, trying not to show how badly my hands were shaking. But there was nothing there. Not a thing. Just the cave, stretching endlessly in every direction, its silence pressing in around me. I was losing my mind. It had to be the isolation, the darkness, the endless passageways that played tricks on me. I'd been walking for hours, exploring, trying to understand the ancient symbols. My mind was just playing games. I forced myself to keep moving, walking faster now, the footsteps growing louder and faster with every step. They were no longer echoes, they were real. I could feel them. They were right behind me, closer, closer with every turn I took. I swung my flashlight around again, this time covering the entire space. But the light swept across the walls and the empty passageways, and again, there was nothing. Focus, I thought. It's nothing. It's just a cave. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I wasn't alone. I was being watched. I pressed on, but every time I turned my head, I could feel something, someone, just out of sight. I could sense it more than see it, a presence that clung to the air around me. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the shadows stretching and twisting in unnatural ways, like they were alive, crawling along the stone in the corners of my vision. Another flicker. This time, it wasn't just in my peripheral vision, it was right in front of me. A shape, dark and formless, shifted in the light just as I stepped forward. My pulse spiked, and I stopped dead in my tracks. I swung the flashlight toward it again, but nothing was there. Nothing but shadows. And me. But as I stared into the empty space, I could feel it, the eyes. I could feel them on me, boring into my back, into my soul, as if the very shadows themselves were watching, waiting. A part of me wanted to turn around and flee, to run as fast as I could out of this cursed place, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. And then, as if to mock my fear, I heard it. A faint sound, so faint, at first, I thought it was the wind. But no, it wasn't the wind. It was soft, a barely audible whisper, like something moving just outside the reach of my flashlight. It wasn't the rustling of clothes or the scraping of footsteps. It was breathing. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear. In. Out. In. Out. It was close now, too close, and I could feel it moving, shifting in the darkness behind me. My mind screamed to turn around, to look, but I was paralyzed, my body frozen in fear. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. The presence behind me, whatever it was, seemed to vanish, leaving only the eerie silence. I slowly exhaled, feeling the tightness in my chest loosen just a fraction. But I couldn't relax. My instincts screamed at me to keep moving, to escape, to get out. I turned slowly and took another step forward, and then, there it was again, the flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. This time, I didn't wait to see if it was real. I didn't need to. Something was here. Something was waiting. And I had to get away from it. I pressed forward, my heartbeat racing in my chest. Every step felt heavier, as if the weight of the cave itself was pulling me deeper into its heart. The shadows seemed to stretch and contort around me, thickening with each breath I took. The walls, once distant and indifferent, now felt like they were closing in, as if the cave was aware of my presence. I could feel it, something was watching, moving in the dark. Suddenly, a sharp chill swept through the air, biting into my skin like icy needles. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as the temperature plunged. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. My exhale was visible. Condensation in the cold air formed a cloud before my face, an unnatural fog in the midst of the dry desert cave. The cold pressed in on me from all sides, sinking into my bones, and the tightness in my chest returned. This isn't right. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, but it was futile. The temperature continued to drop, like an invisible hand pulling the warmth from the air, replacing it with a biting cold that clawed at my skin. I glanced down at the ground, seeing the faintest traces of frost beginning to form along the cave floor, then tendrils creeping outward from the walls. The shadows around me seemed to grow thicker, darker, their edges turning sharp and jagged, like they were somehow alive, reaching and twisting toward me. They were no longer just shapes in the periphery, they felt real, tangible, as if the darkness itself was trying to suffocate me, to swallow me whole. I took another step forward, hoping to shake the feeling of being surrounded. But the shadows followed, always just beyond my reach, like hungry creatures stalking their prey. The cold intensified. My breath came in short, visible bursts, the frost in the air dancing like tiny snowflakes in the beam of my flashlight. My fingers trembled as I gripped the flashlight tighter, the metal handle cold against my skin. But it wasn't just the flashlight that was cold anymore. The air was alive with it, as if the cave itself was exhaling the chill, feeding it into the space around me. I turned around sharply, instinctively, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in. My mind screamed that I wasn't alone, that something was there. But when I shone the flashlight toward the darkness behind me, it revealed nothing. Only the endless stretch of stone walls, the jagged edges catching the faint light, and the deeper blackness beyond. I could still feel it, though. The presence. The thing that was following me, drawing closer with every passing moment. The temperature dropped even further, and now my breath was coming in visible puffs, each exhale a cloud that lingered in the air a moment longer than it should have. The cave was alive with it, responding to my fear, twisting and warping with my every step. I took another step forward, and my foot caught on something. I stumbled, catching myself before I fell, and shone the flashlight down to see what I tripped over. A thick layer of frost covered the ground, a patch of ice that seemed out of place in the dry, stone cave. It shouldn't have been there. The cave was never cold like this. But it was. A low, creaking sound echoed through the passageway, so soft at first that I thought it was my own mind playing tricks on me. But then the sound grew louder, unmistakable, like the shifting of ice under pressure. The frost on the ground spread outward, and the air grew heavier with the cold, as though the cave was exhaling, breathing its icy breath down on me. I snapped my head around, feeling my heart race in my chest as the cold deepened. The shadows seemed to pulse, thickening and undulating, as if the very darkness itself were alive and aware. It was responding to me, my fear, my unease, and it was growing stronger, more malevolent. A sharp, sudden sound rang out, a scraping noise that sent a shock of terror straight through me. It was like the scratching of claws on stone, and it came from somewhere deeper within the cave, echoing off the walls in a low, guttural growl. It was too loud, too real, and too close. My breath quickened, coming in ragged bursts, and I forced myself to move again, to keep going, but the temperature kept dropping, the shadows kept thickening, and the cold was pressing down on me, smothering me, suffocating me. I couldn't escape it. No matter how far I walked, it was there, right behind me, something unseen, something that didn't belong. The walls themselves felt like they were closing in, squeezing tighter with every step I took. The darkness seemed to press against me like a physical force, a weight that I couldn't shake off, no matter how desperately I tried. The cave was alive, and I was trapped inside it. I moved faster now, my heart pounding like a drumbeat in my chest, but the shadows seemed to grow heavier with every step, pressing in from all sides, making it harder to breathe. The air was thick, suffocating, and no matter how fast I walked, it felt as though the cold had settled deep into my bones, anchoring me in place. The feeling of being watched, that constant, oppressive sense that something was following me, grew stronger, tighter. It was no longer just the shadows, it was something else, something that didn't belong here. And then, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. A dark shape, tall, thin, and elongated, loomed in the distance, standing at the edge of the beam from my flashlight. It was a figure, too far to make out in detail, but it was undeniably there, its form shifting in the darkness, like a shadow that had grown too large for its own skin. I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. The shadows had been playing tricks on me all along, right? This was just another illusion. Maybe it was the cave itself, playing with my senses. I was alone. I had to be. But there it was again. The figure, no, not a shadow anymore. A presence. Its outline was faint, but I could feel it, a thick weight in the air. It was watching me, standing just out of reach, its form almost solid, as if it had been born from the darkness itself. I could feel the temperature drop further as I stared at it, a coldness creeping over my skin that had nothing to do with the chill of the cave. I took a step forward, trembling, my flashlight locked onto the shape. I couldn't look away. I had to know what it was. But then, as if the darkness had swallowed it whole, the figure was gone. 1 second it was there, and the next it was nothing but empty space, just the smooth, cold stone of the cave. I stood there, my body frozen in place. My mind scrambled for an explanation. It had to be a trick of the light, a reflection from the walls, something that my mind had manufactured out of fear. It was nothing. Nothing. I repeated it like a mantra, but deep down, I felt the edges of my confidence begin to crumble. I turned slowly, sweeping the beam of the flashlight across the space around me, looking for any sign of movement, any trace of what I had seen. But there was nothing but the cave, the cold, the deepening darkness. My hands were shaking now, and I had to steady myself, taking a deep breath, trying to ground myself in the present. It was nothing. Just your mind playing tricks on you. But even as I told myself this, I knew it wasn't true. The air had shifted again, the silence deepening. I could feel it, something was there. Watching. I took another step, more cautiously this time, my eyes darting over the walls, the shadows, every corner of the cave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hiding in the dark just ahead of me, waiting for me to make the next move. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. This time, it was closer. The figure stood at the far end of the passageway, just beyond the range of my flashlight's beam. Its form was darker than the shadows, its edges blurring and twisting as though the darkness itself was trying to absorb it. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline, tall and elongated, looming in the dark like a nightmare that had taken shape. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision, but when I looked again, nothing. The figure was gone. No. No, no, no. I scanned the passageway in a frantic panic, my flashlight trembling in my hands as I fought to control the rising tide of fear. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the sinking feeling in my gut told me otherwise. Something was here. Something was hunting me. I couldn't explain what I'd seen. The shadows had shifted, yes, but that wasn't enough to explain how solid the figure had felt, how the temperature had dropped around it. It wasn't just an illusion. It wasn't just my mind. The cave had changed. It wasn't just a place. It was alive. And it was responding to me. My breath came in shallow gasps as I forced myself to keep moving, my legs heavy, my mind screaming at me to leave, to run, to get out of here. But I couldn't. I was trapped. There was no escape. I couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes, of someone watching me from the shadows. Every time I turned my back, I felt it. Every flicker of movement, every breath, every shift in the air, I was being hunted. And the worst part was, I didn't know what was hunting me. I only knew that whatever it was growing closer. I had reached a point where my instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I didn't listen. Every rational thought in my head had been drowned out by a growing sense of compulsion, an unexplainable need to push forward, deeper into the cave. The walls began to constrict around me, narrowing until the space felt almost claustrophobic. The further I ventured, the tighter it became. I had to duck at times to avoid scraping my head against the jagged stone, my shoulder brushing against the rough surface as I squeezed through. I could feel the weight of the cave pressing in from all sides, a palpable force that made the air heavier with each step. The temperature, already unnatural, had dropped even further, and it wasn't just the cold, it was the density of the air, thick and suffocating, as though the cave itself was breathing, drawing the life out of the space. The sound of my footsteps echoed around me, the small, crunching steps growing louder in the silence. But as the walls closed in, the echoes began to sound wrong, as if the sound was stretching, distorting in a way that made my skin crawl. The space was alive, and I felt it. The deeper I went, the more it seemed to respond to me, pulling at me, twisting the air around me. My flashlight flickered, a brief stutter in the beam of light. I paused, holding my breath, watching as the beam steadied. But the shadows stretched in unnatural ways, longer than they should have been, creeping out from behind the rocks and curling around me like fingers reaching for my legs. It was becoming harder to breathe. The air was thick now, heavier than before, and every inhalation felt strained. I forced myself to keep going. I couldn't stop. There was no turning back. The thought gnawed at the back of my mind, like the whispers of something dark, something that wanted to drag me deeper. As I rounded another narrow corner, I found myself in a wider chamber. The walls had widened for a moment, but even this opening felt like it was closing in on me. The rock ceiling above me was low, and the floor was uneven, sharp, angular rocks sticking up from the ground, threatening to trip me. I looked up, and for the first time, I realized just how far underground I had traveled. The ceiling above me was low, but I could still make out the rough edges of ancient stalactites that hung down like jagged teeth. There was no light from above, not even the soft glow of the outside world. The cave had swallowed me whole. I was cut off. I felt something in the air shift again. A subtle tremor, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my senses flare. The walls felt different now, darker, more oppressive. The faint scratching sound from earlier was back, but this time it was louder, closer. It wasn't just the sound of my footsteps on the gravel anymore. There was something else in the darkness, something alive, something that moved with purpose. A deep chill settled over me. It wasn't just the temperature that had dropped, it was the atmosphere, the very essence of the cave that seemed to turn on me. The shadows seemed to grow, lengthen, and pulse in the corners of my vision. I stumbled forward, but the space felt too tight, too narrow. The deeper I went, the more I could feel the weight of the earth pressing down. I had been in caves before, and navigated tunnels and labyrinths of rock, but nothing had felt like this. There was an intelligence here, a malevolence that seemed to pulse within the walls themselves. The air grew denser still, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the distant sound of shifting stone and the occasional, unnatural scraping, like claws on rock. I tried to rationalize it. It's just the cave settling, just natural sounds. But the sound came again, sharper this time, and it was followed by something else, a faint thudding, almost rhythmic, like footsteps that weren't my own. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as the shadows seemed to shift, inching closer, tightening in around me. The feeling of being watched returned, and this time it was far more tangible than before. The shadows were no longer just an empty void, they were alive, and they were closing in. I reached for my flashlight, my hand shaking, and shone it toward the source of the sound. There was nothing. Just stone. The rough, jagged walls that seemed to stretch forever in every direction. But something in the back of my mind knew. I wasn't alone. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, a presence, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. The shadows behind me were thicker now, pulsing with something alive. Something ancient, something that had been waiting. I took a hesitant step forward, but then I heard it again, a low, rasping sound that made my stomach lurch. The scraping was louder, closer, coming from the narrow passage ahead of me. I had reached the heart of the cave, and I knew, deep down, that I was being led somewhere. Somewhere I didn't want to go. The walls pressed in tighter, and for the first time, I felt a sense of true terror. The air was thick with a presence that was growing stronger, and the only way forward was deeper into the dark. And I knew, with a growing certainty, that I might never come back. The deeper I ventured into the cave, the heavier the silence became. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a weight. The kind of silence that pressed down on you, squeezing out every sense of reality, leaving nothing but a suffocating, endless void. I stopped. The echoes of my footsteps that had accompanied me until now had vanished completely. I stood still, listening, but all I could hear was the rapid beating of my own heart. The cave had swallowed everything. There was no wind, no distant rumblings from the earth above, no faint trickle of water in the deeper crevices. Nothing. Just an all-encompassing silence that seemed to stretch beyond the walls, beyond the rock, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. For a moment, I wondered if it was the cave itself that had somehow isolated me, like an impenetrable barrier between the living world and this cold, unyielding place. It was as though the very fabric of reality had been torn, leaving only this suffocating, oppressive darkness behind. The silence wasn't just eerie, it felt like an abandonment, a cruel joke played on someone who was foolish enough to wander too far into the depths. The sense of isolation was growing. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of everything. I reached up, running my hand along the cold, rough surface of the cave wall, trying to ground myself in the familiar feeling of stone beneath my fingertips. But it only seemed to amplify the loneliness, as though the very rock itself was empty, hollow, like a giant tomb that had been forgotten by time. The air, too, felt different now. It was thick and heavy, but there was no breeze, no moisture, no movement. It was as though the entire world outside had ceased to exist. No birds, no animals, no signs of life. Just me, alone in the dark. And yet, somehow, I didn't feel safe in my solitude. The longer I stood there, the more the silence pressed in on me, until it felt like I was drowning in it. I tried to speak, to break the silence, to shatter the suffocating stillness with my voice. But when I opened my mouth, no sound came. I couldn't even hear my own breath. It was as if I had been completely erased from the world. I swallowed hard, the dryness in my throat nearly choking me. I had to get moving. The longer I stood still, the more the silence wrapped itself around me, threatening to swallow me whole. I forced myself to take a step forward, but even the sound of my feet scraping against the rock was muted, dampened. It was as if the air itself had absorbed the sound. Every step felt like a violation, a disruption of the unnatural quiet that hung in the cave. But something was wrong. I couldn't shake the sensation that, despite all of the silence, something was watching me. I turned slowly, scanning the shadows, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the impenetrable darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. It was then that I realized I wasn't alone. The silence was not empty. It was filled with something ancient, something watching from the depths of the cave, something that had been waiting. But I couldn't see it. I couldn't hear it. And that was the most terrifying part of all. The absence of sound, the absence of movement, made the presence of whatever was lurking in the dark all the more terrifying. I had become the prey in a world where no sounds could reach me, where no help could come. The shadows were closing in, the silence was deepening, and I was powerless to stop it. Every step I took felt like it was drawing me further into the heart of something alive. And though I didn't want to, I couldn't help but keep moving. I had no choice. But as I moved deeper, I felt the first stirrings of true panic. The world outside no longer existed. The silence was all-consuming, as though I had been forgotten entirely. And in that silence, I began to hear something else. Something soft. A whisper. A voice, far in the distance, almost imperceptible. And though I could barely hear it, I could feel it. It was calling me. I froze, the air around me seeming to thicken, the shadows pressing in on all sides. The whisper grew louder, clearer, until it seemed to echo in my mind. It was like a memory, a half-forgotten dream, something I couldn't place, something I shouldn't have heard. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but the whisper only grew more persistent. It wasn't coming from anywhere outside. It was coming from inside the cave, inside my own mind. The voice was growing closer. It knows I'm here. I continued down the winding passage, the oppressive silence still pressing on me like a weight I couldn't shake. Every step felt heavier, each breath more labored, as if the air itself was trying to hold me in place, stop me from moving forward. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. Some invisible force, was pulling me deeper into the cave, into its heart. Eventually, I reached a wider chamber, one that opened up like a hollow mouth, swallowing me whole. The space felt different here, strangely colder, the shadows darker. The air was thick with a damp, earthy smell, and the ground was uneven, scattered with rocks and broken stalagmites. But it wasn't the environment that made my skin prickle, it was what I saw ahead. On the walls of the chamber, there were more drawings. Ancient, faded symbols and shapes smeared with what appeared to be ash or charcoal. But these were different from the ones I'd seen earlier. They weren't just abstract markings, they were figures. Creatures. Things that looked almost human, yet twisted and grotesque. I took a hesitant step forward, my eyes narrowing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The creatures on the wall seemed to shift with the light, their limbs contorting in unnatural angles, their bodies elongated, twisted in ways that defied all logic. But it was their eyes, their glowing eyes, that drew me in. They seemed to shine with an otherworldly light, even though the room was almost completely dark. As I moved closer, I could make out the details of the drawings. Some of the figures had elongated arms, reaching out toward the center of the chamber, while others appeared to be hunched, crouching in strange poses. There were hundreds of them, more than I could count, stretching across the walls, as though they were all watching me. Each drawing seemed to have its own unique features. Some had too many eyes, others had fangs or horns, and some had limbs that seemed to twist and writhe, like serpents. Their eyes glowed in the faint light of my flashlight, brighter and more unnerving the longer I stared at them. It was as if they were alive, as if they were waiting for me to make a mistake, to step too far into their world. A shiver crawled up my spine, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I stepped back, my mind racing to rationalize what I was seeing. These were just drawings, ancient depictions of creatures from a long-lost civilization. But something deep inside me resisted the explanation. It wasn't just the creatures on the walls that unsettled me. It was the feeling, the overwhelming sensation that these drawings were not mere art, but symbols, representations of something far darker, something alive. I swallowed hard and took another step back. The walls seemed to press in closer around me as I stared at the drawings, and a strange dizziness overtook me. The more I looked at them, the more I felt like they were moving, like the eyes of the creatures were following my every motion. I tried to shake off the feeling. "It's just my imagination," I whispered to myself. But even my own voice sounded foreign in the suffocating silence of the cave. I could feel the cave's atmosphere shifting around me, thickening. The symbols on the walls seemed to grow more vivid, more real, with each passing second. I could almost hear a low hum vibrating from the walls themselves, a deep, resonating sound that seemed to echo through my bones. The air grew heavier again, almost suffocating, pressing against my chest as I stared at the figures. The chamber had a strange, almost claustrophobic quality to it, even though it was wide and open. I felt the walls closing in on me again, as though the cave itself was alive, and the more I lingered, the more I would be trapped in its hold. I glanced over my shoulder. The passage I had come from was still visible, but something in my gut told me I shouldn't look away from it for too long. It was as if the cave was trying to guide me somewhere, to trap me in the center of this strange, ancient symbol-laden chamber. The walls felt like they were closing in on me again, even though nothing had physically changed. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and began to walk toward the farthest wall, hoping to find an exit, or at least something that would explain the madness of what I was seeing. But as I moved closer, I saw more symbols, more drawings, each one darker than the last, more twisted, more horrific. And then, in the deepest corner of the chamber, I found something that made my blood run cold. A figure. It was different from the others. This one was larger, more detailed, more grotesque. Its limbs were stretched out, far too long, and its body was covered in strange, jagged markings, almost as if the creature had been carved into the stone itself. The eyes, though, they were what truly terrified me. They were empty, black voids, but they seemed to pull me in, as if they could see inside me, deep into my soul. I staggered back, a wave of nausea washing over me. The figure on the wall had an aura of presence, not like the other drawings, but like it had always been here, like it had been waiting for me to find it. My pulse quickened, and a deep sense of dread pooled in my stomach. I wasn't just trapped in the cave. I was being drawn into something. Something older than the cave itself. Something that had always been there, waiting for me to step too far. And now, I had found it. The mystery of the symbols had just become the reality of my nightmare. The air was suffocating. The deeper I delved into the cave, the more intense the feeling of being watched became. It wasn't just a sensation anymore, it was a presence, one that was no longer lurking just beyond my sight. It had moved closer, and I could feel it wrapping around me, seeping into the very walls of the cave. The shadows in the corners of the chamber no longer seemed like simple imperfections in the light. They had taken form, swirling and shifting with a life of their own. I stepped back, my hand brushing against the cold, jagged surface of the cave wall, seeking comfort in the solid rock. But the touch only amplified the unsettling energy in the air. My heartbeat pounded in my chest, the rhythm quickening with each passing moment. I turned my head, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was moving in the shadows, but every time I looked, the darkness seemed to shift and ripple like liquid. A whisper slid into my ear, faint and indistinct. I froze. It wasn't just the usual eerie hum of the cave, not the sound of the wind or the shift of loose stones. This was something different, something personal. It was as though the whispers were alive, woven from the very darkness itself, moving around me, slipping through the spaces I couldn't see. I tried to focus, to understand the words, but they were garbled, just out of reach. It felt like something was inside my head, pressing into my thoughts, pushing them aside to make room for its own voice. The sound was soft, almost comforting, as if it were coaxing me deeper, urging me to follow the shadows. Another whisper. This one was clearer, but still unintelligible, too foreign, too alien. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking beneath me, trying to distance myself from the shadows. But it was pointless. The dark was everywhere, surrounding me, thickening with every breath I took. I reached for my flashlight, the beam shaking in my trembling hands as I swept it across the room, desperate to break the grip of the unseen presence. But no matter where I aimed it, the shadows only grew darker, deeper. They didn't retreat from the light, they embraced it, pulling in its glow like it was just another part of them. I could feel my heart racing. This isn't normal. The symbols on the walls, the creatures, the twisted figures, felt like they were growing in number, filling the room with their staring, glowing eyes. The cold, heavy air pressed in tighter. It was as if the cave had turned against me, as if it had become aware of my presence, aware of my fear. My breath came in ragged gasps now, each inhale sharp and shallow. The whispers were louder, almost rhythmic, like a chant, but still indecipherable. Every time I turned my head, the shadows seemed to shift, moving just out of sight, too quick for me to catch. They were no longer just vague shapes, they had grown more distinct, more solid, like figures just waiting for the moment to reveal themselves. I could feel their eyes on me, even if I couldn't see them. I stumbled forward, my body moving almost instinctively, my mind too clouded with fear to make rational decisions. I had to escape. I had to get out of this place before the shadows consumed me. But no matter how fast I moved, the whispers followed, growing louder with each step. They were inescapable, like a part of the cave itself. A part of me. I was being surrounded, cornered by the dark, by something ancient and insidious. The walls of the cave seemed to close in on me, and I could hear the faint scrape of something moving, something following, just out of reach, yet impossibly close. I turned in a circle, trying to track the source of the sounds. But all I saw were the twisted shadows, writhing and flickering at the edges of my vision. The darkness was no longer just a backdrop, it was becoming an entity, alive and watching, reaching out to swallow me whole. A sudden rush of movement made me spin. The shadows weren't just whispering anymore. They were touching me. I felt the cold, clammy sensation of something brushing against my skin, like fingers trailing along my arms, brushing against my face, grazing my neck. I recoiled, stumbling back in horror, but there was no escape. The cave, the shadows, the whispers, they were everywhere. In the distance, the shadows flickered again, and for a split second, I thought I saw something, a figure, half-formed, shifting between the cracks of the darkness. Its eyes glowed, faint and distant, like dying embers, but they burned with a predatory light. It was there, watching. I took a deep, ragged breath, trying to steady myself, but my body betrayed me. A surge of panic rose in my chest, suffocating me, and I could no longer tell if the whispers were coming from the shadows, from within the cave, or from my own mind. I needed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, just the overwhelming sensation of being hunted, of being swallowed by the dark. I was trapped, not just by the physical walls, but by the terror that had seeped into me, that had become a part of this place. I'm not alone. The whisper came again, clearer now. This time, I could almost make out the words. Come closer. I turned, but the darkness seemed to close in faster than I could move, swallowing me whole. The shadows pressed in, smothering me, and I knew, deep down, that I had only just begun to understand the true horror of what waited in the cave. I was losing my grip on reality. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that creeping sensation, the undeniable sense that I was not alone anymore. The shadows had become a presence, a tangible force that was pressing in on me from all sides. The whispers, God, the whispers, were no longer just faint, distant echoes. They were growing louder, clearer, filling the space around me. And with each passing moment, they seemed to speak more directly to me. Come closer. I tried to shake the words out of my mind, but they clung to me, wrapped around my thoughts like a vice. The temperature in the cave had dropped further, and my breath came out in invisible clouds, as if the very air had turned against me. My heart pounded in my chest, echoing in the silence between the whispers, drowning out all other sounds. I clutched at the wall, trying to steady myself, trying to make sense of what was happening. It's just your mind. You're tired, maybe dehydrated. You've been alone for too long, isolated. This is just stress. It's all in your head. But even as I tried to convince myself, the words of my inner monologue sounded hollow, desperate. The shadows had shifted again, and now they seemed to move in a slow, deliberate way, like they were waiting for me to make the wrong move. Each flicker in the corner of my vision was an invitation. Every whisper was a pull toward the unknown. I swallowed, trying to breathe deeply, to calm the panic rising inside me, but it was as though the air was becoming thicker, heavier. I couldn't get enough of it. My head felt foggy, my thoughts scattered, and I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. You've seen these drawings. You've read about the history of these caves. It's just the isolation. You're not hearing anything. It's just the wind, the way the rock shifts in the cold. Everything has an explanation. You're being irrational. There's nothing here. Nothing but old drawings. But with every rationalization, the whispers grew louder. They were no longer distorted, no longer fragmented. They were clear now, sharp, as if they were coming from just behind me, breathing in my ear. Closer. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat. The cave seemed to stretch in every direction, its vastness closing in on me, yet I couldn't see anything. The air hummed with a low, unsettling frequency, and the shadows flickered with an almost unnatural rhythm, as if they had a mind of their own. I staggered back, stumbling over loose rocks, trying to regain control. My legs were shaking. My hands were clammy, the flashlight in my grip trembling so violently I could barely keep the beam steady. But even the light didn't seem to help. The shadows absorbed it, pulled it in like a sponge, and with each flicker of the beam, the darkness seemed to shift, to grow deeper. It's just... I tried to finish my thought, but it died in my throat. There was something behind me now. I could feel it. The coldness on my neck, the heaviness in the air, the way the space around me seemed to shift. Something was moving, just beyond my reach, just out of my line of sight. I spun again, but there was nothing, just the endless cavern, the walls of stone that seemed to close in tighter with each passing second. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs felt like they were glued to the ground, frozen in place. And through the fog of panic, I could hear them, the whispers, now so close, so distinct that I could almost feel them brushing against my skin. You cannot leave. I froze, the words cutting through the terror like a knife. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't imagined that. It hadn't been a figment of my fear. It had come from inside the cave, from the shadows themselves. The darkness was speaking to me. I forced myself to take a deep breath. No, this was madness. I had to pull myself together. I was an experienced hiker. I was a researcher. I had been in dangerous situations before, faced challenges that seemed impossible. I could survive this. This was nothing more than something psychological. You're just tired, dehydrated, scared. I repeated the words like a mantra, clinging to the rational thoughts as though they could anchor me to reality. But the shadows weren't letting me go. They crept closer, pressing in around me, thickening the air, demanding my attention. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breathing shallow, frantic. My thoughts were fraying at the edges, and I couldn't stop myself from looking at the dark corners of the chamber. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Something told me I had to see it. I turned toward the farthest corner, my flashlight trembling in my hands. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, as the beam flickered, I caught movement. A figure. Dark, formless, yet undeniably there. It was watching me. I felt my stomach turn as it took shape, its edges wavering like smoke. It was tall, impossibly tall, with eyes that burned, glowing in the darkness. Eyes that knew me, that saw me. And it wasn't just a figure in the shadows. No, it was moving, drawing closer, stepping forward out of the dark as though it had been waiting for me, as if it had always been there. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were voices, calling to me, beckoning me to come closer, to come deeper into the cave. I stumbled backward, trying to escape, but the figure was already too close. The cave had closed in around me, and there was no way out. I wasn't alone. And the shadows, they weren't just shadows anymore. They were something far worse. I was losing my mind. The deeper I went, the more the cave began to take on a sense of purpose. It wasn't just a labyrinth of stone and shadow, it felt like it had been built this way, designed with some ancient intent that I couldn't comprehend. My heart still thudded in my chest, and my every step seemed to echo too loudly in the silence that enveloped me, yet there was an almost unnatural stillness to the air now. Even the whispers had quieted, though I knew they were still there, lurking just beyond the reach of my consciousness. Then, I found it. It wasn't a stone, or a statue, or anything I could immediately categorize. It was a low, flat structure, an altar, perhaps. It was ancient, covered in centuries of dust, and its surface was covered with carvings so intricate that they almost seemed to pulse in the dim light of my flashlight. The stone had a strange sheen, slick and almost alive. It was a dark, glossy black, and the carvings twisted around its edges in patterns that resembled both symbols and creatures, half-formed, their limbs stretching out in unnatural poses, their faces obscured, but their eyes gleaming even in the dark. I approached cautiously, my boots scraping against the ground, the only sound in the vast, suffocating silence of the cave. My breath was shallow as I slowly circled the altar, my flashlight beam moving over the surface. At first, the symbols were faint, unreadable. But as I moved closer, the carvings began to become clearer, more detailed, and the figures, they began to come to life. I stopped. There, etched into the stone, were the creatures. Tall and thin, their bodies elongated, like shadows come to life. Their faces were twisted in ways that were not just grotesque, but unnerving, long, sharp features, gaping mouths that seemed to whisper even without words. And their eyes, those eyes, they gleamed with a light that was wrong, like they were lit by something that should not exist in this world. They were watching me. No, they were waiting. I leaned in, trying to make sense of the drawings, of the patterns that spread across the altar like a sickening web. The figures, they were feeding. The carvings showed them in various stages, some crouching over human forms, their faces contorted in agony as they reached out with long, clawed hands. Others were depicted towering over groups of smaller creatures, as if they were the masters, feeding on them, drawing their essence into their twisted forms. And then, there were images of those same creatures feeding on something else, fear. The symbols shifted, twisted in ways that made my skin crawl, and I realized what they were illustrating. These were creatures that didn't just feed on flesh, they fed on fear itself. The fear of their victims, drawn out and consumed as though it was nourishment. I recoiled, stepping back from the altar. A chill ran down my spine, my skin prickling with dread. All of a sudden, everything made sense, too much sense. The whispers, the shadows, the growing feeling of being haunted. It wasn't just the dark. It wasn't just the isolation. These creatures, these things, had been waiting here for thousands of years, feeding off the fear of those who ventured too far into their domain. I had been naive, so focused on uncovering ancient history, ancient knowledge, that I hadn't considered what kind of knowledge this cave might hold. The drawings, the symbols, they weren't just art. They were warnings. This altar was a place of worship, but not for any god I had ever studied. It was a shrine to something far older, far darker, an entity or force that had been feeding off the terror of lost souls who wandered too deep into these caves, drawn by the lure of ancient mysteries. The realization hit me with the weight of a falling boulder. I wasn't just exploring a cave. I wasn't just studying symbols or ancient cultures. I had wandered into the lair of something alive. Something that had no intention of letting me leave. The altar, I now understood, was not merely a structure, it was a trap. A lure. Something to draw me deeper, to keep me here, where I could be fed upon. My mind raced, grasping for some kind of explanation, but the truth kept breaking through. The fear was what kept them alive, what kept them strong. The more terrified I became, the more powerful they grew. The whispers were their voice, their call, their command to draw me in. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear my breath coming in sharp gasps, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough to drown out the deafening realization that was settling in my bones. I was trapped. This place wasn't just a physical cave, it was a psychological trap, and I had walked straight into it, believing I was safe, believing I was simply a researcher, an explorer. But now, I understood. I had become a prey. I backed away from the altar, my legs shaking, my mind desperately trying to push away the images of those twisted, hungry creatures. My flashlight flickered again, casting long, creeping shadows on the walls, and I knew they were closer now. I wasn't just exploring. I was being hunted. The air grew heavy around me, pressing in from all sides. The shadows, which had once been distant and elusive, now seemed to be folding in on me, growing thicker, darker. It wasn't just the darkness. No, this was something else, something deeper. I could feel it, the presence. It was like a force, intangible but undeniable, creeping toward me from every corner of the cave. I could sense it in the very marrow of my bones, a weight in the air that made it harder to breathe. My chest felt tight, and my breath came in shallow gasps, quick and panicked. It was as though the fear that had been bubbling just beneath the surface, rising in my mind like a boiling pot, had now materialized. It was no longer just a feeling. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It was here. With me. I stopped moving, heart pounding. The cave was silent, the only sound my frantic breathing, but the silence felt wrong. It wasn't a natural quiet. It was oppressive, as if the space itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Waiting for me. My eyes darted around the chamber, searching for anything out of place, but the shadows were empty, still. The altar, the symbols, the walls, they were all exactly as they had been. Yet, despite their stillness, something felt alive in this space. The air hummed with an almost electric charge, like a storm was brewing, but there were no clouds, no thunder. Just silence. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my legs were frozen, rooted to the ground by something far more powerful than fear alone. My hands trembled, holding the flashlight like a fragile shield. I swung it in a wide arc, trying to cut through the dark, but the beam flickered and the shadows clung to the edges of the light as if it had no effect at all. "You're imagining things," I told myself. "It's just the fear." The darkness is playing tricks on you. Stay calm. But it wasn't just fear anymore. It was presence. I could feel it, crawling up my spine, pressing on my chest. I tried to steady my breath, but it was useless. The cave, the shadows, they were alive. They were pressing in from all sides, their presence a palpable thing, as though the cave itself was watching me, waiting for me to move, to give in to the terror that clawed at my mind. My pulse thundered in my ears, louder than anything else. My skin prickled as I stood frozen in place. The shadows were moving in the traditional sense. They weren't figures or shapes I could see, they were everywhere, all at once, engulfing me from within and without. It was as though the air itself had turned to shadow, and the space around me had shrunk, closing in tighter, suffocating me. A chill swept across my skin, the temperature in the cave dropping so quickly that I could see my breath misting in front of me. It was as though the fear had become physical, filling the space with an oppressive weight. It felt like the cave itself was alive, pulsing with the same dark energy that had drawn me here in the first place. The walls seemed to close in, the rock itself now pressing against me, pushing against my ribs, forcing the air from my lungs. I couldn't breathe. The fear had swallowed everything, sound, sight, even the air I needed to survive. It was everywhere, crawling over me, filling my lungs, my mind, my very soul. The shadows had taken on a life of their own, a heavy, dark presence that wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. I could feel it creeping closer, a dark hand closing around my throat, threatening to squeeze the life out of me. I spun around, my flashlight scanning the darkness, desperately searching for an escape, but there was nothing. Nothing but the creeping shadows. And then I heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable, whispers, soft and sibilant, like 1,000 voices all speaking at once. You cannot escape. I froze. The voice was closer now, not just in my head but in the very air around me, as if the shadows themselves were speaking. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from, or even if it was coming from somewhere at all. It was everywhere, in every direction, pressing in, suffocating me. I felt my knees buckle, and I reached out to steady myself, my hands touching the cold, slick stone of the cave wall. But as I made contact, a surge of cold ran through my body like an electric shock. The shadows were alive with the touch, pulsing, vibrating with dark energy. I recoiled, but the darkness followed, pressing in from every angle. It was too much. You belong here now. The words were clear now, distinct, and they weren't just whispers, they were a command. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My body was shaking, my muscles frozen in terror, and I could feel my heart racing, thudding in my chest as if it were trying to escape. The fear wasn't something I could push away anymore. It had taken shape. It had become a living, breathing force in the cave, and it was feeding off me, feeding off my panic, my fear. I could feel it grow stronger, thicker in the air, as if the longer I stood there, the more it became me. You cannot leave. The whispers were louder now. They were a force, an entity, pulling me down, wrapping me in the suffocating darkness. The cave was no longer just a cave. It had become a prison, and I was its captive. There was no escape. The presence was closing in, and all I could do was wait. I tried to move. My legs, heavy with terror, felt as though they were trapped in cement, each step a battle against an invisible force. My heart thundered in my chest, echoing through the silence that surrounded me. The darkness closed in around me, not just pressing in from the walls, but bending, twisting, like it had a mind of its own. I turned back. The altar, the markings, everything had been left behind in the rush of my desperate need to flee. My breath came in short, jagged gasps, but it was useless. The path I had taken to get here, clear and defined just moments ago, was gone. The cave had shifted, like it was a living thing, reshaping itself in response to my fear. I stumbled forward, my hands scraping along the rough, jagged walls. I could feel the stone under my fingers, but it no longer felt solid, no longer felt like it belonged to the earth. It felt like it was part of the darkness, part of the suffocating, ever-tightening grip around me. The floor beneath me was no longer familiar. What had been a straightforward passage had twisted into a maze of narrow tunnels and sharp turns. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing and shrinking, as if the cave itself was alive, constricting around me, forcing me deeper into its heart. No. 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 I whispered to myself, but the sound of my own voice only made the fear inside me grow, twisting like a sick knot in my stomach. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, only panic, only the instinct to survive. It's the cave. It's changing. My mind screamed for clarity, but nothing made sense anymore. I had been here, just moments ago. I knew the way. The entrance had been back there, just behind me. But now, nothing looked familiar. I spun around, swinging my flashlight desperately, hoping for a sign, anything that would tell me I was close to an exit. But all I saw were shadows, dark, crawling shadows, stretching and reaching out toward me as if the very cave was trying to swallow me whole. The beam of my light cut through the dark, but only illuminated more of the twisting, inescapable path, and the shadows seemed to mock me, retreating only to reappear as I moved. I could feel my breath, shallow and ragged, clogging in my throat as panic consumed me. The walls loomed closer, and the ceiling felt like it was lowering, pressing down on me as I staggered backward, only to find myself caught in the same maze, lost within it. My chest tightened. Every step I took only made the space feel smaller, more confining. This isn't real. It isn't real. The mantra spun in my head like a broken record, but it didn't help. No matter how many times I told myself that the cave wasn't changing, that I wasn't being trapped, it didn't stop the overwhelming feeling of being surrounded, of being haunted. The whispers came again, not in the distance, but right next to me. In my ear. You can't leave. I froze, unable to move, unable to escape the truth of the words that reverberated in my mind. They weren't just words, they were a command, a truth carved into the very fabric of the cave. It was as if the darkness itself had a voice, and it was laughing at my futile attempts to break free. I turned sharply, my flashlight sweeping the walls, but every turn, every glance, led me only deeper into the winding, unfamiliar passageways. The way I had disappeared. The cave wasn't just changing, it was confining me, closing me in with every step, like the walls were moving, folding in on themselves to keep me trapped. I couldn't escape. I couldn't even find where I had come from. The sharp edge of panic sliced through me. I screamed, my voice echoing off the walls, but the sound felt wrong, distorted. Like it was swallowed whole by the cave, never reaching the outside world. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing in on me from all directions, and I realized there was no outside anymore. There was only this. I backed into a corner of the cave, my eyes frantically scanning the walls for some sign of an escape, some way to break free. But all I saw were the twisted, alien markings, the grotesque shapes on the rock, the eyes watching me from the darkness. My flashlight flickered, and the shadows seemed to flicker with it, alive in ways I couldn't understand. It's all part of the trap. The thought hammered at me like a drumbeat. The cave didn't just hold me. It wanted me here. The creatures I had seen, those twisted, hungry figures in the drawings, they were real. They were in the darkness, waiting for the fear to consume me completely. And I was feeding them. I shook my head, trying to clear the panic that clouded my mind. I had to keep moving. I had to keep trying, or I'd lose myself completely. I couldn't let the fear win. But every step I took felt like it was taking me deeper into the cave's suffocating grip. The walls seemed to shift again, this time more violently. My vision swam, and the shadows blurred together. It was no longer clear where I was, or where I was supposed to go. I screamed again, but there was no one to hear me. "You can't leave. You're not meant to." The voice returned, this time more distinct, more solid. And with it, I understood the truth. The cave wasn't just a place. It was a thing, a living, breathing creature. And it had no intention of letting me go. I could feel it before I saw it, something moving in the shadows. It wasn't a subtle movement, but rather a slow, deliberate shift, as though the very darkness itself was alive, bending and swirling with purpose. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. My breath caught in my throat. The flashlight flickered again, the beam struggling to cut through the inky blackness. But in that brief, fragile moment when the light barely held steady, I saw it. A figure. At first, it was just a shape, a black silhouette against the deeper shadows of the cave. But then, as my eyes tried to focus, I saw the eyes. Glowing, faintly at first, like embers, before they flared, burning with an unnatural light that pierced through the dark. I froze, unable to move, my entire body locked in terror. The figure, it didn't move like anything human, or even animal. Its limbs were twisted, inhumanly long, and its body was shadowy and distorted, the edges blurring in and out of my vision. It seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as though it was made of nothing but the very darkness I had been trying to escape. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating, and I realized that it wasn't just the cave closing in on me. It was this creature. It was feeding on my fear, and with every breath I took, it grew stronger. My heart was pounding in my chest, faster now, a rapid, erratic drumbeat of pure terror. The creature's glowing eyes seemed to pull me in, drawing me deeper into its gaze, and I could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on me, crushing me under the intensity of its stare. I wanted to look away, but my body wouldn't respond. I couldn't tear my eyes from those burning orbs, couldn't shake the feeling that if I moved, if I dared to blink or look away, it would strike. I could hear its whispers now, faint at first, like 1,000 voices speaking at once, but slowly, the words began to separate, became clearer. "You fear us. You always have." The voice was not just in my ears, it was in my mind, crawling into my thoughts like a parasite, wrapping itself around my consciousness. The darkness around me thickened, and I realized that the cave wasn't just trapping me, it was feeding. The more terrified I became, the more the creature thrived. It was drawn to my fear, to my panic, to every ounce of dread I felt in my bones. "You are ours now." The words were like ice, chilling me to the core. My hands trembled as I clutched the flashlight, desperate to keep the beam steady, but it was useless. The light seemed weak against the force of the creature's presence, and I could feel my grip slipping, my fingers numb with fear. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed, trapped in this space with the creature, unable to break free. The creature took a step forward, and with it, the shadows seemed to move with it, closing in around me like a wave. The air grew colder still, my breath now visible, fogging in front of me with each panicked exhale. I could feel the weight of its gaze on me, its eyes burning into my very soul. And then, in a horrific realization, I understood. The creature wasn't just here. It wasn't just watching me. It was feeding on the very fear that was surging through my veins. My terror, my helplessness, was its sustenance. It took another step toward me, and I stumbled backward, but my feet were tangled, my legs weak, my body betraying me. The shadows seemed to stretch with every movement I made, as if the cave itself was closing in to trap me. I couldn't escape. The creature wasn't just a thing in the dark, it was the dark, and it had been waiting for me, feeding on me, pulling me deeper into its lair with each beat of my terrified heart. I tried to move, tried to push through the paralyzing fear, but it was like the cave itself was part of the creature. The walls seemed to ripple with it, bending and twisting, and every step I took only brought me closer to it. The creature's eyes flared brighter, its twisted form shifting, and for a moment I saw its true shape, a shadow that was more like a living, breathing nightmare, with long, spindly limbs that reached toward me, fingers like claws, grasping, pulling. "You cannot run." The voice was louder now, inside my head, and I knew that it wasn't just the creature speaking anymore. It was the cave itself, the very space around me. It was alive with hunger, and I was its prey. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to escape, but there was nothing I could do. The fear was all-consuming, and in that moment, I realized the truth. The cave had never been just a place of ancient drawings, a relic of the past. It was a predator, a creature of darkness, and I had wandered right into its grasp. I was its next meal, and it would not let me go. The creature's eyes were locked on me, and I could feel them burning through me, digging into the very marrow of my bones. It was impossible to look away, its gaze pulling me deeper into the shadows, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I thought I might simply collapse under its weight. But something inside me snapped, a surge of raw panic, an instinct to survive that kicked in, drowning out the cold grip of fear that had paralyzed me moments before. I wasn't ready to die. Not here, not like this. I had come to the cave searching for answers, for ancient truths hidden in the darkness, but this was no longer about research or discovery. It was about getting out alive. I scrambled to my feet, every inch of my body trembling, every thought drowned in terror, but my legs moved anyway. My flashlight flickered again, casting wild, frantic beams across the walls, but the shadows closed in around me, swallowing the light like it was nothing. The creature took another slow step toward me, its twisted limbs stretching unnaturally, fingers curled like claws. "No. No, no, no." I shook my head, barely aware of the words tumbling from my lips. The creature's whispers were rising, growing louder, and I could hear its voice behind my eyes now, inside my mind, filling the space with a cold, suffocating presence. "You cannot fight us. You cannot run." I reached down, fumbling in the dark, and grabbed a jagged rock from the ground. The sharp edge scraped my hand, but I didn't care. My heart hammered in my chest, a frantic rhythm, and my vision was blurring. I swung the rock wildly at the creature, every fiber of my being desperate to make contact. It was an instinct, fight, anything, but the moment the rock hit the creature's form, it passed through, like it was nothing more than smoke, like it wasn't even real. The creature jerked back, and for a split second, I thought I had a chance. But then it moved, faster than I could process, a blur of dark limbs and glowing eyes. My heart lurched in my chest, and I stumbled back, the world spinning around me. The cave was no longer a place, it was a living, breathing entity, its walls pulsing and shifting, constricting, drawing me deeper into its nightmare. I couldn't fight it. It was too powerful, too real, and nothing I did made a dent. The creature wasn't just made of flesh, it was made of the very fear that now consumed me, and my attempts to strike back were futile, meaningless. I had to run. Panic exploded in my chest like a thunderclap, and my legs moved before I had the chance to think, propelling me forward, away from the creature, away from the suffocating darkness. I turned and sprinted down the narrow tunnel, the rough stones scraping my palms as I tried to steady myself against the walls. My breath was ragged, my heart pounding with every step, every breath of air that I could barely draw in. The shadows seemed to stretch and move with me, and behind me, I could feel the creature following, moving through the dark with unnatural ease, its presence like a cold wind nipping at my heels. I couldn't hear it, the creature didn't make a sound, but I knew it was there, just behind me, its glowing eyes flashing in my mind's eye, its claws reaching for me. I ran faster, my legs burning with exhaustion, but I didn't dare slow down. If I slowed, if I faltered for even a moment. I heard it then, a faint, distant sound, soft at first, but growing louder, closer, like the scraping of claws on stone. It wasn't just in my mind anymore. It was real, there. My throat tightened, and a fresh wave of terror surged through me. The cave had come alive, and I was trapped in its jaws. I had to keep running. Keep running. The path ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls growing tighter, the air thicker, as if the cave was deliberately leading me deeper. I turned another corner, desperate for a way out, but it was like the tunnel was folding on itself, closing me in. There was no way forward. Only darkness. My pulse roared in my ears. The light from my flashlight was almost gone, flickering erratically. It was like the cave was draining the very life out of me, one heartbeat at a time. I was losing myself in the dark, and the creature was closing in. There was no way to stop it, no way to fight it. I couldn't see it, couldn't hear it, but I felt it. I knew it was there. It's not real. It's not real. I tried to tell myself that, tried to block out the overwhelming terror. But my mind was unraveling, slipping into madness. The cold, dark walls pressed in around me, and I knew, deep down, that I would never escape. And then, the darkness shifted. I felt it in my bones, in the very air around me. The walls opened up, widening into a cavernous space. The sound of something massive stirring reached my ears, a low, resonant hum that filled the air, making the very ground beneath me tremble. The creature was here. It was waiting. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My breath caught in my throat as I spun around in a last-ditch effort to find a way out. But there was nothing. There was only the cold, empty gaze of the creature, its glowing eyes locking with mine, a final, suffocating embrace of fear that would be my last. And then, darkness. My heart was hammering in my chest, each frantic beat a reminder of my desperation. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, only run. My feet pounded against the cold, uneven stone of the cave floor, my legs burning from the effort, but I couldn't stop. If I stopped, I would die. That was the truth. That was the only truth. The creature was behind me. I didn't need to see it, didn't need to hear it, because I could feel it. Its presence pressed down on me, like an invisible weight, suffocating the very air. The shadows seemed to stretch out, clawing at my ankles as I raced forward, the tunnel ahead growing darker, the path winding tighter. I tried to focus, tried to remember which way I'd come, to trace the path back to the entrance. But the cave was changing. The walls were shifting, narrowing, making it impossible to find the way out. Every time I thought I saw a way forward, the path disappeared into an uninviting blackness. And then I heard it. A faint sound, just on the edge of my perception, like the soft scrape of claws on stone. But it wasn't behind me, it was in front of me. Just ahead. And then, another. From the other side, like it was circling me, hunting me. The creatures weren't just following, they were anticipating. They knew where I was going before I did. I stumbled, my foot catching on a jagged rock, and I caught myself just in time. The fear, the terror, surged through me, more intense now, as if the very ground beneath my feet was pushing me toward the abyss. It knows. The thought sliced through my brain like a blade. I wasn't just running from something in the dark. I was being stalked, hunted. The creatures were moving in the shadows, ahead of me, always ahead. I took another step, my legs trembling beneath me, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do? How could I outrun something that knew me better than I knew myself? How could I escape when the cave itself was part of the trap? The silence that followed was suffocating, and for a moment, I thought I'd lost them, thought that maybe, just maybe, the creatures had given up the chase. But then the air shifted. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, a prickling sensation that crawled down my spine. I turned instinctively, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark, but I saw nothing. The cavern stretched endlessly in every direction, the walls closing in, narrowing with each step I took. And then, I heard it. A soft, deliberate step, a whisper of movement behind me, so faint that I thought it might have been my imagination. But then came another, and another, each one slow and deliberate, like the creature was savoring the chase. I spun around, my heart in my throat, the beam of the flashlight shaking violently in my hand. The darkness was thick, too thick for the beam to penetrate. The shadows twisted and writhed, mocking me, as if they were alive, shifting with a mind of their own. I could feel the weight of those eyes, watching me from the corners of the cave, from the deep, unreachable places where the light couldn't touch. I had to keep moving. There was no other choice. I couldn't stop, couldn't afford to think. My thoughts were a jumbled mess of panic and confusion, and all I could do was run, run, run. But no matter how fast I went, no matter how hard I pushed myself, the feeling never left. The creatures were getting closer. They were playing with me, toying with me, letting me think I had a chance, only to snatch it away in the next moment. The ground seemed to tremble under my feet, and I realized then that the cave wasn't just a place, it was alive. The walls were shifting, pulsing with a rhythm that was far too deliberate to be natural. I heard another sound. This time, it was a deep, rasping breath, too close. I whipped my head around, but again, there was nothing. Just darkness. The flashlight was no help anymore. It was as if the light couldn't touch the true horror that lurked here. I kept running, my breath ragged, my muscles aching, my mind screaming for a way out. But there was no escape. The cave was closing in, and the creatures were always one step ahead, anticipating my every move. Every turn I took led me deeper into the maze of shadows, and every step I made brought them closer to me. The hunt had begun. I couldn't hear their footsteps, couldn't see them, but I felt them. They were there, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, waiting for me to make a mistake. And they would. I was already too far gone. I can't outrun them. I can't escape. That thought kept repeating in my mind like a mantra, but I refused to stop. The panic was a raw, pulsing force inside me, propelling me forward even though I knew it was futile. Every instinct screamed for me to fight, to do something, anything, but I couldn't. My hands were trembling too violently, my thoughts too scattered to make a rational decision. And then, just as I was beginning to lose hope, I heard something different. A voice. Not a whisper. Not the creature's voice. This one was real. It came from behind me, soft at first, then louder. It was human. Help. The sound was faint, desperate, and it was enough to send a shock of adrenaline through my body. I turned, breathless, and saw a flash of movement in the shadows. For a moment, I thought it was another person, another survivor, but when I blinked, it was gone. And then the walls shifted again. I froze. Something was coming. I wasn't alone anymore. I barely had time to process the voice before I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of something moving in the dark. It wasn't the same whispering scrape of claws on stone. No, this was different. This was something alive, something real. Something close. I spun, the flashlight flickering wildly as I tried to catch sight of the source. The beam cut through the darkness, but it revealed nothing, only the twisted, endless corridors of stone. My breath came faster, erratic. The oppressive silence wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket, broken only by the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. But then came the sound again, closer this time. A scrape. A shuffle. A breath, low and ragged, like it was just behind me. I wasn't alone. The fear that had been bubbling in my chest exploded into raw panic, forcing me to move. I didn't care which direction, I just had to get away. I sprinted forward, my legs nearly giving out beneath me as I twisted and turned down an unfamiliar path. The walls were closing in, tightening their grip on me, and the sound of movement was right there, just behind me. I could feel it, could feel the creatures growing closer. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The cave was becoming an impossible maze, every path a dead end or a narrowing tunnel that threatened to swallow me whole. The air grew thick with the smell of damp stone and rot, making it harder to breathe. My thoughts were a tangle of terror and confusion. Every part of me screamed to run faster, to outrun the growing shadow that seemed to follow my every step. Then it happened. I took a turn too sharply, my foot catching on an uneven ledge in the stone. I stumbled, my arms flailing for balance, and crashed to the ground with a sharp gasp. The flashlight flew from my hand, the beam spinning wildly before it finally landed in the dirt, casting fractured shadows against the walls. My heart stopped as I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something drawing closer. Closer. I scrambled to my feet, panic flooding my system. I had no time. There was no time. The creature was almost on me, and I could feel its presence, its cold, suffocating presence creeping up my spine, like it was about to reach out and grab me, pulling me into the dark with it. With a strangled cry, I reached for the flashlight. My hand fumbled in the dark, but my fingers found the cold plastic just in time. I jerked it toward me and clicked it on, and for a moment, I thought I had evaded it. The beam of light cut through the space, revealing only the jagged stone and empty air. But that moment of relief was fleeting. From the shadows, a figure moved. It was a blur of darkness, too fast for my eyes to catch, but I felt it, saw its glowing eyes before it melted into the shadows again, just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. My heart jumped into my throat, and before I could even think, I was running again, as fast as my legs could carry me. I ran, but the path was twisting, spiraling deeper into the cave. Every turn, every step, brought me closer to something darker, something more dangerous. The feeling that the creatures were always ahead of me, waiting for me to make a wrong move, was unbearable. Each narrow escape pushed me to the edge, chipping away at the fragile threads of my sanity. The sound of claws scraping stone echoed behind me again, closer this time, more deliberate. It wasn't just one anymore. There were multiple creatures, moving together, closing in. I could hear their breathing now, low and jagged, like something dying. It made my skin crawl. The walls seemed to grow tighter, forcing me to duck under low overhangs and twist my body through narrow gaps, but there was no room for escape. I couldn't outrun them. I thought I heard a voice again, something faint, distant, but it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't a call for help. This time, it was laughter. A low, mocking sound that seemed to come from all directions at once, reverberating off the walls of the cave. They were toying with me. I pushed myself harder, the air thickening with every step. The creatures were faster than I had imagined. They weren't just moving in the shadows anymore, they were everywhere, circling, closing in. Each time I thought I caught a glimpse of one, it would vanish into the dark, always just out of reach. The darkness seemed to warp around me, the walls shifting and contracting like they were alive. The narrow passages became tighter, the air thicker, suffocating, and every step felt like it was taking me deeper into the heart of the cave, deeper into its grasp. I could hear them now, their movements getting louder, more pronounced. It was no longer just shadows, no longer just whispers. I could hear the scrape of claws, the dragging breath, the pulse of their presence like it was inside me, filling every crack in my mind. I had to keep moving. I couldn't stop, couldn't let them get closer. My hands were trembling so violently that I could barely hold the flashlight, but I couldn't afford to drop it. If I lost the light, I would be lost. I would be dead. A low rumble echoed through the cave, and the ground beneath my feet trembled. The creatures weren't just hunting, they were closing in, surrounding me. I took another desperate turn, but the tunnel ahead of me collapsed into a dead end. My breath caught in my throat, panic rising again, but then I noticed something in the shadows. A small opening, just barely big enough for me to squeeze through. Without thinking, I lunged toward it, pushing my body through the tight space as my heart hammered in my chest. I barely made it. The ground gave way beneath me, and I tumbled into the next chamber, landing hard against the stone floor. My hands scrambled for purchase, but as I lifted my head, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The creatures, their glowing eyes now fixed on me, closing in from all sides. And I realized, with a sickening certainty, that I wasn't escaping anymore. They had already won. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on me. Every step I took felt like it was getting harder to breathe, harder to think. The air in the cave seemed to thicken, heavy with something that wasn't just the scent of damp earth. It was suffocating, like the cave itself was alive, aware, and it was closing in on me. I ran, but it didn't matter. The path I thought I'd just taken, twisting and turning, a small semblance of control, was no longer there. The walls of the cave, once jagged and imposing, had changed. They shifted, bending at odd angles, creating new tunnels and closing off others as though mocking my every move. I turned a corner and found myself face to face with a blank wall. How could that happen? I had just passed through here. The creatures were still there, though. They were still following me, always so close, their footsteps relentless, always just out of sight, just behind me. I could hear them now, not just in the distance, but all around me. Their footsteps echoed in the cavernous darkness, scraping against the stone like claws on bone. They moved in perfect synchrony, a pack hunting, and I was their prey. The cave wasn't just a labyrinth. It was an entity, alive, changing. I could feel the stone shift beneath my feet as I ran, as though the ground itself was rearranging to keep me in place. I had been in caves before, real ones, those that twisted into labyrinths of natural formation, but this felt wrong. This wasn't nature. It was a mind, a consciousness, a predatory force that responded to my panic and fear, twisting and contorting to trap me. I stumbled again, my hand slamming into the rough wall for balance as I tried to regain some semblance of direction. The flashlight flickered in my hand, its beam weak and shaking. Every time I thought I was gaining some ground, I turned another corner only to be met with the same dead ends, the same narrowing passageways that closed in tighter with each step. And then the whispers returned. Faint at first, barely audible, like the rustling of dry leaves. I tried to push the sound out of my head, to ignore it, but it grew. The whispers became clearer, sharper, like words wrapped in breathless urgency. It was as if the cave itself was talking, speaking to the creatures that hunted me, telling them where I was going. I felt it again, something brushing against the back of my neck. A cool draft that wasn't a breeze, but a presence. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing. Except for the eyes. They were there, just within the edge of the flashlight's dim beam, glowing like coals in the darkness, cold and alive. Too many. I froze. My pulse was hammering in my ears, and the air felt thicker now, pressing against my chest as though the cave itself was trying to crush me. There was no escape. No way out. I bolted forward again, but as I did, I felt the change. The walls, the tunnel, everything around me shifted. The cave was closing in, shifting its shape like a living thing. The ground beneath me quaked as if it had a pulse. The narrow corridors I had been sprinting through now twisted and turned like some grotesque reflection of the outside world. The path that had once seemed open now felt like a maze, and I was no longer sure which way was forward or backward. I skidded to a stop at a bend in the cave, heart racing, breath ragged. My flashlight flickered again, casting ghostly shadows against the stone. The creature's eyes, too many eyes, watched me from the dark. I didn't understand. I couldn't. Why wasn't I getting anywhere? Why did it feel like the cave was changing with me, anticipating my every move? Was this really the cave itself, or was something else, guiding me deeper, forcing me to go in circles, to fall deeper into fear? The walls seemed to lean in, and I could hear them, their voices, now unmistakable, reverberating off the stone. It wasn't just a whisper now. It was a chorus, a cacophony of voices, none of them clear, but all of them speaking the same chilling message: you are never leaving. I pushed against the walls, trying to force myself through the ever-shifting tunnels, but it was useless. Every turn, every new passage was just another trap. The creatures were getting closer. I could hear them now. Too many steps, too many scraping, too many whispers, too many eyes. They were everywhere. They had always been. The cave wasn't just a maze anymore. It was a trap, an extension of their will. The creatures, they weren't chasing me, they were leading me. They had always known the way. And I was the one lost. My breath was ragged, every inhalation sharp and painful as I pressed on. The creatures were still there, the eyes, the whispers, they never stopped. They were always just there, lingering at the edges of my sanity, following me like a shadow that I couldn't escape. The tunnel seemed to close in around me, its walls shifting with an unsettling awareness, as if they were alive, watching, breathing with me. I had to get out. I didn't know how much longer I could keep running. And then, through the haze of panic and fear, through the shaking light of my flashlight, I saw it. A narrow slit in the stone, barely visible in the dim light, hidden behind a cluster of jagged rocks. The opening was small, too small for comfort, but it was a way out. The thought hit me like a sudden burst of hope. Could this be an escape? Could this passage lead me to safety, or at least a place where I could breathe again? I didn't think, I didn't hesitate. I scrambled toward the opening, the stone scraping painfully against my palms as I pressed myself forward, my body trembling with exhaustion and terror. Every step felt like 1,000, but I was so close to freedom. I could feel the cave's pulse beneath my skin, vibrating, almost as if the walls themselves were aware of my intentions. The opening was tight, impossibly narrow. My shoulders scraped painfully against the rock, but I was desperate. I had no choice but to push through. I could hear the creatures now, their low growls reverberating from the shadows, too close. I needed to make it. I had to. I pushed harder, my breath caught in my throat, my fingers scrambling for purchase as I slid into the passage. My heart pounded in my chest, the fear almost suffocating, but I was through. I was in. The tunnel stretched ahead, dark and cramped. There was no turning back now. I pressed forward, my body protesting with every move, but I refused to stop. The fear of the creatures, the fear of what might be behind me, drove me onward. I needed to escape. I had to. But the deeper I went, the more I could feel it. The walls were changing. At first, it was subtle, a faint shift in the air, a slight difference in texture beneath my fingertips. Then, I noticed it more clearly. The walls were alive. As I crawled, the rock beneath my hands and knees felt soft and pliable, like skin, and it seemed to shift, moving, tightening, as if it was trying to keep me from going forward. I stopped. I had no choice but to stop. The walls were pressing in, squeezing me, pulling at my clothes, my limbs. Every inch I tried to move forward felt like a battle, like the tunnel was closing in around me, tightening with a force I couldn't explain. Panic rose in my chest, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. What was this place? Why was the tunnel closing? I shoved forward, gritting my teeth against the pressure. The walls seemed to breathe with me, like they were alive, like they were aware of my fear, feeding off it. The harder I fought, the tighter they became. Every inch forward felt like an eternity, the stone scraping against my skin, the oppressive pressure threatening to crush me. The creatures were closer now. I could feel them, their presence crawling along my spine. Their eyes were everywhere, even in this confined space, glowing like hot embers just beyond my reach. I could hear them, the scraping of their claws against stone, too close, too close. I screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed off the walls of the narrow passage. My mind was unraveling, my thoughts spinning in a haze of terror and desperation. But the passage wouldn't let me go. The walls, alive and hungry, were pulling me back. I pushed harder, ignoring the pain as I squeezed forward. The walls seemed to move with me, compressing around my body, threatening to suffocate me. The claustrophobia was unbearable. I was no longer sure if the passage was shifting with the pressure, or if the very presence of the creatures was warping the space around me, bending it to their will. No, no, no. I had to get out. I kept moving, inch by inch, feeling the passage constricting around me, suffocating me. Every breath felt like it might be my last. The walls, slick with moisture and dread, seemed to shift, pushing me back, pushing me deeper into the dark. And then, I heard it. A low, wet click. A sound that made my blood run cold. The tunnel, the living stone, was closing in. I wasn't going to make it. I wasn't going to. The walls compressed harder, and I screamed again, thrashing against the stone. I pushed with all my strength, feeling the space around me grow smaller and smaller, and the creatures, their eyes, were pressing in, too. I could hear their laughter, their whispers, mocking me, taunting me for thinking I could escape. But I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. And then, just as the walls felt like they might crush me entirely, I felt it, a gap. A space. A place where the stone opened up just enough for me to slip through. I reached for it, my hand trembling as I squeezed through the narrowing tunnel. My body protested, every inch of me on fire, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I pulled myself through, and for a moment, I thought I was free. But then I looked back. The passage was gone. It had closed completely. And I was trapped again. I stumbled into the narrow space, the air thick with the musty scent of earth and fear. I could feel it now, the weight of the cave closing in around me, suffocating me with its presence. I had been running for what felt like hours, my legs numb, my mind unraveling. I didn't know where I was anymore, didn't know how much further I could go. All I knew was that there was no way out. I had reached a dead end. The walls, jagged and dark, rose up before me, offering no escape. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide. The cave had trapped me. And the creatures, they were close, so close now, their eyes glowing faintly from the darkness. I could hear them, their movements deliberate, patient, and it felt as though the very air was alive with their presence. They were everywhere, closing in on me from all sides. I pressed my back to the cold stone, my hands trembling as I tried to steady my breath. Sweat trickled down my forehead, mixing with the dirt and grime on my face. I could hear them, the faint scraping of claws against stone, the soft whisper of breath behind me. They were circling, watching me, knowing that I had nowhere left to go. I was cornered. The realization hit me like a brick to the chest. There was no escape. No path forward, no way out of this living nightmare. I had tried everything, running, hiding, squeezing through narrow tunnels. But the cave was alive. It bent and twisted to its own will, responding to my fear, trapping me in its grasp. And the creatures, they were no longer just following me. They were waiting, circling like vultures around their prey. I turned around, hoping for some miracle, some crack in the stone, some hidden door I had missed. But the walls were solid, unyielding. No way forward. Only the dark, endless void of the cave and the cold, glowing eyes watching me from all directions. I thought of the altar, the symbols, the drawings on the walls that had come to life, the creatures that fed on fear. They weren't just haunting me. They were part of the cave. Part of this place. I had come looking for ancient knowledge, for the truth hidden in the darkness, but what I had found wasn't a discovery, it was a trap. The cave was a predator, and I was the prey. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. The whispers were louder now, coming from all around me. There was no escaping them. No escaping them. The creature's laughter, sharp, guttural, hungry, echoed through the cave, and I realized with sickening clarity that they weren't just playing with me. They were feeding off me, off my fear, my desperation, my utter helplessness. They were getting closer, and I could hear their claws scraping along the walls, the cold, dead sound of their approach. My body trembled, but I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to fight, to run, to do anything, but my legs refused to obey. I was trapped in the corner, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. I knew I had no chance. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying, begging, hoping for something, anything that would save me. But there was nothing. The air was thick with dread, the oppressive weight of the cave pressing in on me from every side. And then, they were there. I opened my eyes, and in the flickering light of my flashlight, I saw them. Shadows that slithered across the walls, figures that barely resembled anything human. Their glowing eyes burned through the darkness, locking onto mine, and I froze. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. They were right there, inches away. I could hear their raspy breathing, their voices, low, guttural, and full of hunger. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. I knew what I had to do. There was no way out. No escape. The creatures would tear me apart if I stayed. The cave would consume me whole if I didn't do something. And so, with the last ounce of strength I could muster, I turned and faced the wall, my back pressed hard against it, and I screamed. I screamed with everything I had left, every shred of fear, every drop of anger, every ounce of pain that had built up in me over the hours of torment. I screamed for my life, for the chance to survive. But it didn't matter. The cave didn't care. I was trapped, cornered, with only one choice remaining. Submit. It was a cruel, final thought that washed over me. There was no fight left, no hope. The creatures didn't need to chase me anymore. They had won. They had always won. And so, I closed my eyes. I let go. I had closed my eyes, ready to embrace the dark, to let the weight of fear crush me, but in the suffocating silence that followed, something changed. The oppressive presence that had loomed over me, the creatures that had stalked me from every shadow, shifted. They were still there, close, too close, but now, instead of the cold, echoing laughter, there was only a deep, low hum. A vibration. A pulse. My breath came in short, ragged bursts as the realization hit me. The fear I had been running from, the creatures, they weren't just hunting me. They were me. Or, at least, they were the manifestation of something deeper, something that had lived in the dark for centuries, trapped in the cave like an ancient curse, like a prison. The creatures weren't just born from the cave's darkness. They were the darkness. I had been a fool. Every step I had taken in the cave, every moment of panic, every whisper, every shiver had fed them. My fear had given them life. They were ancient fears, born from the deepest corners of the human psyche, trapped in this place and waiting to be unleashed. And now, as I stood on the edge of insanity, they were finally free, finally able to take shape and claim their prey. But no! I was done running. Done hiding. I took a deep, shuddering breath, feeling the cold air flood my lungs. My hands were trembling, my whole body on the verge of collapsing, but I stood tall, my back straight against the stone. I couldn't allow myself to break now. Not why I had come this far. Why? I whispered, my voice cracking with the weight of my fear. The creatures were still there, their presence pressing against me, their glowing eyes burning into my skin, but I wasn't going to be consumed by them. Not anymore. One of them, the largest, its body a grotesque swirl of shadow and shifting limbs, stepped forward. I could see the glimmer of its eyes, yellow and burning with hunger. It tilted its head, studying me, as though it could feel the shift in my energy, the change in my resolve. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. It was feeding off me. Feeding off the terror, the uncertainty, the sheer despair that I had carried with me all this time. And now that I understood, now that I had seen it for what it truly was, I knew I could take it back. I wasn't going to let it win. "You thrive on fear," I said, my voice trembling, but growing louder with each word. "But I won't give you mine." The creature hissed, its form flickering as if in response to my defiance. The others stirred, slithering in the dark corners of the cave, their eyes narrowing with rage. They were not used to being challenged. They had existed for so long in the shadows, feeding on the fear of those who dared to enter, those who dared to trespass. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had spent so long running, so long hiding, but now I was here, standing face to face with them. And for the first time, I saw them for what they truly were, not monsters, not creatures, but reflections of every fear I had ever buried deep inside myself. The fear of the unknown, the fear of the dark, the fear of being alone, the fear of death. They were all here, in these creatures, and they had been feeding off my own weakness. I took another step forward, my body trembling but my mind clear. "You want fear? Take it. Take everything. But I won't let you control me. Not anymore." The cave seemed to respond to my words. The ground beneath me shifted, the walls creaking with a low, ominous groan. I could feel the pulse of the creatures, their presence like 1,000 invisible hands pressing against my chest. They were angry now, the air thick with their rage, but I could see them more clearly now, each twisted form, each grotesque movement, each glowing eye. They were just illusions. They were nothing more than shadows. And I knew, deep down, that the only way to stop them was to stop being afraid. The creature in front of me snarled, its body rippling with darkness, but I didn't flinch. I didn't move. The fear, the terror that had consumed me for so long, was slipping away. I could feel it dissolving, leaving me with a cold clarity. And with that clarity came a sudden, overwhelming surge of anger. Anger at myself for allowing them to control me. Anger at the cave for trapping me. Anger at the creatures for feeding on my weakness. "Enough," I muttered under my breath. And then, without warning, I lunged at the nearest creature. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know if it would work. But I had to try. I had to fight. My body collided with the shadow, my hands outstretched, and for the briefest moment, I thought I had missed, thought I had been swallowed by the dark again. But then, I felt it. A strange resistance, as though the very essence of the creature was shifting beneath my touch. It was afraid. And in that moment, I understood. The creatures, the shadows, they were born of fear, but they could be fought. They could be overcome. If I no longer feared them, if I stood my ground, they would lose their power. I pushed harder, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature let out a screech, its form beginning to distort, unraveling in the light of my defiance. It was fading, dissipating, just like a nightmare when you finally wake up. The others, their eyes dimmed, their movements slowing. They too were beginning to disappear, vanishing into the darkness they had come from. And then there was silence. The silence that followed was not relief. It was the stillness before the storm, an unnatural calm that hung in the air like a threat waiting to strike. I stood there, my breath shallow, my heartbeat echoing in the oppressive quiet. I had pushed back against the fear, and for a brief moment, I thought it had worked. The creatures, those twisted, shadowy figures that had plagued my every step, seemed to waver and weaken in my defiance. But that moment was fleeting. The shadows around me shifted, coiling tighter, pulsating like a living thing. The air grew thick once again, suffocating, as though the cave itself was pressing against me. I could feel the weight of it, the crushing pressure of the darkness that filled every corner, every crevice. I knew what was coming. The creatures, they weren't done. They couldn't be. My legs trembled, a cold sweat breaking out along my neck, but I refused to show it. I had faced them once. I could do it again. But this time, they weren't fading away. I heard the low hiss before I saw them. A whisper in the dark, then a sudden movement. The first creature appeared from the shadows, its form more solid than before, more defined. It was no longer a fleeting wisp of darkness. It had shape now, arms, legs, a body twisted and malformed, like a thing born of nightmares. Its eyes glowed brighter than before, burning like twin suns, locking onto me with a hunger that made my skin crawl. The air grew heavier, thick with malice. The temperature dropped. I could see my breath now, misting in front of me, but it wasn't from the cold. No, it was from the creatures. They were feeding on my fear, and it was making them stronger. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. I had to stop this. I had to keep my fear in check. But as the creature drew closer, I felt it again, the pull of its gaze, the way its presence gnawed at my very soul. Every step it took toward me, I felt my resolve weakening. The darkness seemed to whisper louder now, its voice rising in my ears. I could hear the crackling of its hunger, feel it crawling under my skin. And then, the others emerged. They were more distinct now, no longer just vague shadows. Their limbs twisted unnaturally, jagged and elongated, like the limbs of grotesque puppets. Their bodies shimmered with an eerie, transparent glow, each one more grotesque than the last. Their eyes, those burning, molten eyes, were fixed on me, piercing through the darkness, watching me, judging me. The creatures were feeding on my fear, and the more I gave into it, the stronger they became. I tried to move, but my legs felt like lead. Every inch I took backward only seemed to bring them closer. They were growing. No longer were they just figures that skulked in the shadows, waiting to strike. Now, they were something solid, something real. They had become nightmares made flesh. A low growl echoed from one of them, a sound that rattled my bones. The creature took a slow, deliberate step toward me, its shadow stretching unnaturally long across the cave floor. The others followed suit, their movements unnervingly synchronized, their glowing eyes narrowing as they stalked closer. My heart pounded painfully in my chest as I struggled to hold on to my sanity, to hold on to whatever shred of defiance remained inside me. I had pushed back before. I had faced my fear and made them disappear. But now they were stronger, clearer. And my fear was feeding them. "Get back," I whispered, my voice trembling, but I forced the words out. "Leave me alone." The words had no effect. They never did. The creatures only grew closer, their shadows swallowing up the light, their figures becoming clearer with every breath I took. They were growing more real, more terrifying. They were no longer just figments of the dark, they were the dark. I could feel it now. I could feel the pull of them, the pressure, the weight of their hunger. They were feeding off the terror in my chest, the primal fear that clutched at my insides. I couldn't escape them. There was nowhere left to run. The cave had turned into a trap, and I was the prey. The creatures stopped just a few feet away, their glowing eyes boring into mine, and I realized something that made my stomach drop. They weren't just shadows. They were the manifestations of my fears born from the deepest parts of my mind. They weren't real in the way I had thought. They were something worse. They were my fears. I wanted to scream, to fight, but the overwhelming dread choked me. Each one of their eyes glowed brighter now, flickering like fire in the dark, and I couldn't look away. I had thought I could fight them, thought I could resist. But how do you fight something that is a part of you? How do you fight yourself? The creature closest to me took another step forward, its body shifting, twisting. Its face was a grotesque mask of pure malice, and I could see now that its form was made up of 1,000 faces, 1,000 different expressions of fear. Faces of people, faces of me. It was my own terror reflected back at me, magnified and twisted into something monstrous. And that's when I understood I couldn't fight them by resisting. I had to let go. I had to face them. Face my fear. For a brief, terrifying moment, it felt like the creatures had won. Their eyes burned into mine, hollow and filled with an insatiable hunger, and I felt as if my very soul was being devoured. The weight of their presence pressed against me, and I could almost hear the pulse of their breath, the rhythmic echo of something ancient and monstrous. My body trembled, paralyzed by an overwhelming sense of dread. Every step they took toward me made the world shrink, the cave closing in, its dark walls pressing tight against my chest. But then, something inside me snapped. It wasn't a conscious decision at first, more like a spark of realization, quick and sharp, cutting through the suffocating fog of fear. They feed on fear. The thought, simple as it was, hit me like a bolt of lightning. And with it came a flicker of clarity. The creatures didn't exist the way I had thought. They weren't shadows. They weren't demons from some forgotten corner of the universe. They were born from fear. My fear. I wasn't just trapped in a cave. I was trapped inside myself. Inside my own terrified mind. I had been running from them, from the terror they brought. Every step, every breath had been soaked in fear. I had fed them. I had given them power by refusing to face what was lurking deep inside me. By refusing to acknowledge my own terror, I had allowed it to grow, to take shape, to manifest. For the first time since I had entered this hellish place, I understood the rules of the game. I had to stop fearing them. I had to stop feeding them. I closed my eyes for just a moment, taking in a shaky breath, forcing myself to center my thoughts. The darkness of the cave no longer felt suffocating, it was just dark. The shadows no longer had the power to twist into grotesque shapes, to claw at my sanity. The creatures, once towering and imposing, were no more than figments of my mind. I had spent too long running from them, from the fear they represented. But it was time to face it. It was time to fight back, not with weapons, not with flight, but with the one thing they couldn't have. My courage. The realization burned in my chest, igniting a fire that pushed back against the cold dread. I stood a little straighter, forcing myself to breathe deeply. I refused to give them what they wanted. They couldn't have me. Not anymore. I opened my eyes, and this time I didn't flinch. The creatures were still there, their twisted forms crouching in the shadows, eyes glowing with hunger. But they weren't invincible. They were fragile. They could only exist as long as I allowed them to, only as long as I allowed them to feed on my fear. I took a step forward, my voice trembling, but I forced the words out. You're not real. It was a simple statement, but the power behind it shocked me. The creature closest to me flinched, its shadowy form flickering for just a moment, like a distorted reflection in water. For the briefest second, I saw it for what it truly was, a manifestation, an illusion, a creation of my own fear. "I won't give you anything," I whispered, my voice gaining strength with each word. "I won't feed you." The air in the cave seemed to shift. The weight lifted, just slightly, as if the pressure of their presence was ebbing away. I could feel their grip loosening, just a little. The dark shadows that clung to the walls retreated, as if uncertain of what to do without the fear to fuel them. The creature closest to me let out a sound, low, guttural, like a growl, but it was different now. It wasn't a roar of power. It was a hiss of frustration. I took another step forward, more firmly this time. "You're nothing but shadows." The light from my own defiance seemed to pierce through the dark. The creatures wavered, flickering like a candle in the wind. Their glowing eyes dimmed, and the oppressive feeling that had been suffocating me began to loosen its grip. I could see them clearly now, for what they were. Not monsters, not demons. Just fear. A fear that had no power unless I gave it strength. With a final, steady breath, I took one more step, and I felt it, an undeniable shift. The creatures shrank back. Their forms melted into the shadows, no longer solid, no longer tangible. They weren't real. Not unless I believed them to be. "You don't control me," I said, my voice steady now, no longer trembling. "I control you." And just like that, the darkness began to recede. The creatures, those twisted reflections of my own terror, were nothing more than memories now, faint echoes that would fade with the light. I had won. Not by fighting with strength, but by facing my fear and refusing to be its prisoner. The cave had been a reflection of my mind, my psyche, and now I had reclaimed it. But even as I stood there, victorious, part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The creatures were gone for now, but fear was a powerful thing. It could always return. And that, I realized, was the true nature of the cave. Not a place of physical danger, but a place where the mind is put to the test. A place where only the strongest can survive, not physically, but mentally. The shadows were closing in again. They were everywhere now, crawling across the cave walls, twisting in the corners of my vision, always present, always lurking. I could hear their whispers, low and insistent, curling around me like tendrils of smoke, suffocating me, pulling me under. The creatures, born from my deepest fears, circled me once more, their eyes glowing with malicious hunger, their forms flickering like broken reflections. I was cornered, trapped in a nightmare of my own making. But this time, there was no running. No turning back. For a moment, I felt the familiar pull of panic, the instinct to flee, to escape. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every breath I took seemed harder than the last. But I refused to give in again. I refused to let them take control. I couldn't run. I couldn't hide. I had tried that, and it had only made things worse. The creatures were relentless, always one step ahead, always feeding on the fear that I'd let consume me. And it was then, as I stood frozen in that cave, surrounded by the dark, that I understood something crucial. The creatures weren't invincible. They didn't have power over me unless I let them. They were born from fear, yes, but they could only thrive if I fed them. The moment I stopped fearing them, the moment I faced them head-on, their power would crumble. I wasn't trapped by the cave anymore. I wasn't trapped by the creatures. I was trapped by my own mind. I had given them the power, I had fed them with my terror. But now I had a choice. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus, to push past the cold grip of fear that had been clutching at my throat. The cave seemed to pulse with the rhythm of my heartbeat. The creatures were closer now, their forms more solid, their glowing eyes burning brighter. They were circling me, their movements slow and deliberate, drawing nearer with every passing second. But this time, I stood my ground. "I won't let you control me anymore," I whispered, though my voice trembled. I didn't care. I had to say it. I had to take that first step. The creature closest to me stepped forward, its form growing larger, more menacing, the shadows stretching out like claws reaching for me. I could feel the cold radiating from it, the hunger in its gaze. I could feel my pulse quicken, my body instinctively wanting to recoil. But I held my ground, refusing to give in to the panic that was clawing at me. "I'm not afraid of you," I said louder this time, my voice shaking but growing stronger. "You're just a shadow, a reflection of my own fears." The creature's eyes narrowed, and I could feel the tension in the air, like the cave itself was holding its breath. The darkness around me seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive, but I didn't back down. I couldn't. "You only exist because I let you," I continued, forcing the words out despite the rising tide of terror threatening to overwhelm me. "You're nothing without my fear. You're just nothing." The creature snarled, its shape distorting, flickering like a flame caught in the wind. I saw it for what it truly was, a collection of fear and shadow, a twisted manifestation of my own mind. It had no substance. It had no power. As I stood there, facing it head-on, something inside me began to shift. The cold, suffocating weight of fear that had settled in my chest began to lift. I could feel the creature's form weakening, its solid shape wavering like smoke in the air. It wasn't real, not in the way I had believed. In that moment, I realized that the cave had always been a reflection of me, my darkest thoughts, my deepest fears. The creatures were nothing but fragments of my mind, taking shape in the darkness. But I had the power to stop it. I had the power to break free. "I control this," I said, my voice growing steadier with each word. "I control you." The creature let out a screech, an inhuman sound, a wail of rage and frustration, as it began to dissipate, its form flickering and distorting until it vanished entirely, consumed by the darkness it had come from. And then, just like that, it was over. The cave fell silent. The oppressive air lifted. The shadows, once so heavy and suffocating, retreated, their grip on the walls loosening. The creatures, my fears, were gone. For the first time since entering the cave, I felt the weight of the air shift. The walls no longer seemed to close in. The ground beneath me felt solid once again. The cave was no longer a prison. It was just a cave. I had faced my fear, confronted it head-on, and in doing so, I had broken free from its grip. The creatures were gone, fading into nothingness, and I was left standing in the silent, empty cave. But I knew this wasn't the end. I had won this battle, but fear was a powerful thing. It could always return. And I would have to face it again whenever it reared its ugly head. But for now, I was free. I had won. The realization washed over me like a cool wave, slowly replacing the burning tension that had gripped me for so long. The creatures, the fear, the shadows, they were gone. I had stood my ground, faced the horrors that had plagued me in the dark recesses of my mind, and I had broken free. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, The cave was silent. The weight pressing down on my chest lifted, and I could breathe again. I turned toward the exit, the dark tunnel that had once seemed like the mouth of a terrifying beast, now nothing more than an ordinary cave passage. The narrow path leading me out felt familiar, almost comforting. The fear that had haunted me was gone, dispelled by my courage, by my refusal to yield. My steps were light as I made my way toward the mouth of the cave, toward freedom. I had done it. I had escaped. The soft glow of the morning sun greeted me as I emerged from the cave's shadow. The New Mexico desert stretched out before me, endless and vast, bathed in the warm, golden light of dawn. For a moment, I just stood there, taking in the open sky, the stillness of the landscape, my heart slowly returning to its normal rhythm. I was free. Or so I thought. As I walked further from the cave's entrance, a strange sensation began to creep over me. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of unease, a brief moment of doubt. But it grew, worming its way into my thoughts, like an insidious whisper. I tried to shake it off, to remind myself that I had beaten the creatures, that I had conquered my fear. But something wasn't right. I paused, looking around, as if expecting the creatures to reappear, their glowing eyes watching from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the vast, empty desert stretching out before me. Yet still, that feeling lingered. I looked down at my hands, feeling a strange tightness in my chest. The sunlight felt too bright, too sharp. My breath caught in my throat as a sudden wave of dizziness swept over me. The air felt wrong, like it was too thin, like it was pressing against me, pulling me down. And then I felt it. A faint pull at the edge of my consciousness. A whisper in the back of my mind. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. It was the same voice I had heard in the cave, the whispers that had once been indistinct, incomprehensible, now clearer, more insistent. They were still there. Still inside me. I stumbled backward, my pulse quickening. The world seemed to blur, the landscape shifting, the desert horizon warping into something unfamiliar. The creatures. No, it couldn't be. The twist came all at once, like a cruel slap in the face. The fear hadn't been vanquished. It had followed me. I had defeated the creatures inside the cave, yes. But I had underestimated them. They weren't just physical, not just shadows and shapes of the mind. No, they were deeper than that. The fear I had confronted, the fears I had run from for so long, they had become part of me. The creatures hadn't been defeated. They had just transformed. I looked down at my hands again, and this time I saw the shadows. Thin, dark tendrils creeping up my arms, wrapping around my fingers like living ink, shifting and flickering. They moved too fast, too erratically, to be fully real, but they were there. They were inside me. It was then that I realized the horrifying truth. The cave hadn't been a place of escape. It had been a mirror, a dark reflection of everything I had tried to suppress. And now, as I stood there in the sunlight, the fear that had once been external had become internal. It was in me. A part of me. The shadows twisted around me again, warping the edges of my vision. I felt a tightening in my chest, and the whispers grew louder, like a chorus of voices in the back of my mind. They were no longer confined to the cave. They were part of me now, woven into the fabric of my thoughts. I had won the battle, yes, but I hadn't truly escaped. I turned back toward the cave entrance, as if drawn by some invisible force. The cave that had once been a place of terror now felt like a sanctuary, a place where the creatures, the fear, could still be contained. But it was too late. The darkness had already spread too far. There was no going back. As I stood there, the desert silent and endless around me, I realized the truth. The creatures, the fear, had been inside me all along. They would never truly be gone. They were always there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise again. And I would never be free. The harsh daylight struck me as I emerged from the cave, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold, suffocating darkness I had left behind. The air felt almost foreign, too fresh, too pure, like I was stepping into a world I no longer recognized. I blinked against the light, shielding my eyes with one hand, feeling the gritty dust of the desert in the air. I was alive. That was the first thing I allowed myself to feel, relief. My breath came in ragged gasps, my muscles sore and stiff from the grueling hours, maybe days, I had spent trapped inside the cave, running from shadows, from my own fear. The pounding in my head, the overwhelming exhaustion that dragged at my limbs, made me feel as though I hadn't just hiked through a desert but had been through a trial of survival. The cave had been a place of terror, but now, as I stood in the open air, it felt distant. I was free. I turned around, looking back at the yawning mouth of the cave behind me, where the shadows still seemed to linger at its edges, but I forced myself to ignore them. I had survived. I had faced the creatures, those manifestations of fear, and I had won. That's what mattered, right? The past was gone. The nightmare was over. The wind blew across my face, carrying the dry scent of sagebrush and earth, and for a moment I stood there, just breathing in the peace of the open desert. It was a sharp contrast to the dark, suffocating world inside the cave. The sky was a brilliant blue, the sun warm on my skin, and the silence around me felt vast, open, comforting. The thought of returning to civilization, to the life I had left behind, almost made me smile. Soon, I would tell the others what I'd found, what I'd experienced in that cave. They'd never believe me, but maybe I could help shed some light on the mystery. After all, I had faced the fear head-on, and I had come out on top. But then, just as quickly, something inside me shifted. A faint sensation, an odd prickle at the back of my neck, a slight disturbance in the air. Something I couldn't quite place. My heart skipped a beat, and my eyes darted around, scanning the empty desert. But there was nothing. No movement. No shadow. I exhaled slowly, shaking off the feeling. It was nothing. Just the remnants of the fear, lingering in my mind like an aftertaste. The creatures were gone. I had seen them vanish, disintegrate into the darkness, and I knew that I had triumphed. They were gone. But even as I told myself that, a nagging thought crept into my mind. The fear wasn't gone. It wasn't just something I had fought in the cave. It had followed me, yes, but it wasn't just a thing. It was a part of me. And I could feel it, crawling beneath my skin like a second pulse. I pushed the thought away. No. I was free. I had won. The desert stretched endlessly before me. I started walking, my steps slow but determined. One foot in front of the other. It wasn't far to the nearest town, and I would make it. I would go back. I would tell them what happened. The world would move on, and so would I. But with every step I took, the feeling inside me grew stronger, an invisible weight pressing down on my chest, a presence that seemed to follow me no matter how far I walked. The wind whispered in the distance, low and almost like a voice calling my name. The world felt off. too quiet, too still. I glanced over my shoulder once more, just to make sure. The cave was there, looming in the distance, but it seemed different now. It didn't just sit on the horizon like any other natural landmark. It felt like it watched me, like it was alive, waiting. I turned away quickly, forcing my eyes ahead, focusing on the path. I was being paranoid, I told myself. The creatures weren't real. The fear wasn't real. I was free. But a part of me knew, deep down, in that place that had once been flooded with terror, that I wasn't free. The cave had been a mirror, and the fear that I had faced had been a reflection of my own mind, my own darkness. But now, the creatures had changed. They had become something different, something more insidious. They weren't confined to the cave anymore. They had become part of me. And now, they were following me. I quickened my pace, my steps echoing in the vast emptiness of the desert. There was no turning back now. The nightmare was over, but the fear? That was something I would carry with me forever. And I could feel it, just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment it would rise again. The town was smaller than I remembered, quieter somehow. Or perhaps I was the one who had changed. It had only been a few days, maybe weeks, I couldn't quite tell, but it felt like an eternity had passed since I had left. The sun was just as bright as it always was in New Mexico, casting long shadows across the dusty streets as I made my way into town. The buildings, the people, everything seemed so ordinary, so normal. But something inside me had shifted, like the world had tilted just slightly, and I could feel it now. The air, once fresh, now felt thick with a weight I couldn't explain. My footsteps echoed too loudly, the sounds of the town too sharp in my ears. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the shock of returning to civilization after the isolation of the caves. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized how alien everything seemed. I walked past the small diner where I used to grab coffee, but the familiar scent of brewing coffee didn't comfort me. Instead, it felt cloying, suffocating. The hum of the cars driving by, the chatter of people on the sidewalks, it all seemed too loud, too present. I wanted to escape, to go back to the quiet of the desert, back to the place where the world felt less distorted. But I couldn't go back. The town, my life, was where I belonged. Or so I kept telling myself. As I passed the corner store, I saw a familiar face, a friend I had known for years, standing outside, holding a cigarette between their fingers. They smiled when they saw me, waving. But as their gaze met mine, I felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. Their smile seemed too wide, too eager. "Hey, you're back. Where have you been?" they called out. I froze for a moment, the words caught in my throat. I had almost forgotten what it felt like to be in the presence of someone so normal. "I was, just out in the desert," I said, forcing a smile, my voice sounding far too thin, too distant. They laughed, but the sound felt off, like an echo in a long empty room. "You always were a strange one," they said, taking a drag from their cigarette. "You look different. You okay?" I nodded quickly, too quickly, and turned away, my heart racing. "I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine." The words echoed in my head, but they didn't feel real. It felt like I was speaking them to someone else, like I was just playing a part in a world that no longer fit. As I continued down the street, the feeling of unease only deepened. I passed by a group of children playing near the park, their laughter ringing in the air like it always did. But it was hollow. The sound seemed distorted, echoing back at me like it wasn't real. I glanced at the swings, where one of the children was pushing another, but something was wrong. The way the swing moved, it was too smooth, too slow, like it was floating. The world felt like a poorly constructed replica of itself, like I was watching it from behind a glass, unable to truly interact with it. And no matter how much I tried to focus on the people around me, on the ordinary things that used to comfort me, it only made the feeling worse. The fear that had once been confined to the cave hadn't gone away. It had followed me, spreading like a sickness, twisting everything in its path. I had faced the creatures, the shadows of my own mind, but they hadn't been vanquished. They were now part of the fabric of reality. Part of me. I could feel them waiting, lurking just beneath the surface of my thoughts, watching my every move. I hurried to my apartment, the familiar hallway feeling more like a maze with each step. My keys fumbled in my hand as I reached for the door, the cold metal of the lock sending a shiver through me. I entered quickly, shutting the door behind me as though trying to shut out the world. I leaned against the door for a moment, closing my eyes. But the stillness of the apartment didn't soothe me. It felt stifling. The air was too thick, too still. I stepped away from the door, my movements slow, deliberate, like I was afraid that if I moved too quickly, the world around me might shatter. I went to the window and looked out at the street below, trying to ground myself in something familiar. But the streetlights flickered. Once. Twice. It wasn't enough to be an actual malfunction, but enough to make my pulse spike, my breath quicken. I turned away from the window, my mind racing. The apartment felt too small, too close, like the walls were closing in on me. The fear that I had thought I'd left behind in the cave had seeped into my bones, like a poison I couldn't rid myself of. I sat on the couch, staring at the empty room around me, trying to pull together some semblance of normalcy. I tried to focus on the mundane, on the way the light from the window played across the floor, on the hum of the refrigerator in the corner, on the ticking of the clock on the wall. But even these small things felt wrong. The clock's ticking was too loud, too insistent, and it seemed to echo in the room, bouncing off the walls like a warning. I couldn't escape it. The creatures, those shadowy figures that had haunted me in the cave, were gone, but their presence lingered. The fear was no longer a distant thing. It had become part of the world around me, woven into every corner, every sound, every shadow. It followed me, like a shadow cast over everything I touched. The world, the life I once knew, had changed. And I was no longer sure if I was still a part of it. The door behind me creaked, and I froze. I hadn't heard anyone come in. I didn't want to turn around. But the whispering in my mind grew louder, and with a sickening sense of certainty, I knew I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone anymore. Days passed, but the sense of wrongness never faded. The world outside my apartment seemed unchanged, yet every corner, every shadow, felt like it was hiding something, something watching, waiting. It started with small things. The flicker of a shadow at the edge of my vision. A rustle in the dark corners of my room while I would sit in silence. I would turn quickly, hoping to catch whatever caused it, but nothing was there. Nothing ever is, I reminded myself. I tried to convince myself it was just the lingering effects of my ordeal in the caves. The mind plays tricks, I told myself. It wasn't real. But then, I began hearing whispers. Soft, almost imperceptible voices, always just out of reach. They would rise out of the silence during the moments I thought I was alone, only to disappear as quickly as they came. I would turn, expecting to see someone behind me, but no one was ever there. The whispers became more distinct over time, the words sharper. At first, I could only catch fragments: my name, my fear, my death. The voices seemed to be echoing from the shadows themselves, as if they had always been there, buried beneath the surface of my life, waiting to be heard. One evening, as I sat alone in my living room, trying to focus on the flickering TV screen to drown out the increasing noise in my head, I felt it again, a presence, standing just behind me. I felt a cold breath on my neck, and I froze. My skin crawled, my pulse raced, and my body instinctively tensed, ready to flee. I slowly turned my head, almost afraid to look. But there was nothing. The room felt suffocating. The air was thick, heavy with something else, something that didn't belong. My mind tried to rationalize it, to dismiss it. It's just the isolation, I thought. The caves mess with my head. I'm just tired. That's all. But that logic began to crumble the longer I sat in the apartment, staring at the same walls that had once brought me comfort. Now, every detail felt foreign. The flickering of the light overhead seemed too deliberate, too purposeful. Every sound, whether the hum of the fridge, the creak of the floorboards, became amplified, like I was attuned to the smallest disturbances, each one a signal that something was wrong. I knew the creatures were real, not in the sense that I could see them, but they were real. They lived in the spaces between my thoughts, in the silence between the whispers. They had become part of me. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw them lurking in the darkness, their glowing eyes burning into my skull. One morning, I woke up to the distinct sound of scratching at the window. My heart leapt into my throat. I leapt out of bed and rushed to the window, but when I threw open the blinds, the street outside was empty. No one was there. Just the stillness of the early morning, like nothing had ever happened. But my body trembled, my breath short and shallow. I knew the scratching had been real. I knew it. It had to be. I tried to ignore it. I tried to go about my day as if everything were fine, as if I weren't haunted by the ever-present fear that wrapped itself around me like a second skin. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more it consumed me. At work, I found myself staring at the corners of the room, at the flicker of lights, at the shadows that seemed to move when no one was looking. I couldn't escape it. The whispers followed me everywhere. I would hear them in the sound of a door creaking, in the silence of the office, in the wind outside my window. And I knew, deep down, they were calling to me, beckoning me back to the cave, to the place where it had all begun. But I couldn't go back. I knew that. I had escaped, hadn't I? I had left the nightmare behind, stepped into the light of day, but the light felt dim now. The world outside seemed tainted, its colors faded, like it had lost something vital. Or maybe it was me who had changed. I couldn't tell anymore. Every night, as I lay in bed, I would hear the familiar sounds, the whispers, the scratching, the soft, shuffling footsteps just outside my door. I would pull the covers over my head, trying to drown it out, to pretend that I was safe, that it was all over. But deep down, I knew the truth. I would never be free. The creatures, those things that had tormented me in the caves, they weren't just part of the cave. They were part of me now, woven into the very fabric of my mind. And as the days wore on, I began to realize something far worse than any shadow, than any whisper. They had won. They had always won. It happened late one night, too late, perhaps, to still be awake, but sleep had become a distant memory. The world outside my window had long fallen into a quiet, deceptive peace, but inside, my mind never rested. The whispers, The scratching, the flickering lights, all had become a constant hum in the background of my life, always present, always waiting. I could never escape them. That night, as I sat in the dim glow of my desk lamp, trying to finish a report that had long lost its meaning, I felt it. The sensation I had come to dread, the oppressive weight of eyes on me. I froze, my pen hovering in midair, the words on the page blurring together as the room seemed to shrink around me. I glanced toward the hallway, then toward the dark corner of my living room. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in the shadows, the kind of movement that might be dismissed as a trick of the light, the shifting of something unimportant. But then, it moved again. My heart skipped a beat. There, in the corner of the room, where the darkness was thickest, a figure stood. It was tall, looming, like the shadows had taken on a shape of their own. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, but I could see it clearly now, etched in the blackness. The outline of a creature. One of the things from the cave. It was no longer just a whisper in the dark, no longer a memory haunting me from the depths of that cursed place. It was real. It was here. I stood, every muscle on my body frozen as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. This isn't possible. This can't be real. I turned away for a moment, but when I looked back, it was closer, too close. The creature's glowing eyes pierced the darkness, and I felt a chill crawl down my spine. Its shape was jagged and distorted, its limbs unnaturally long, twisting in ways that no human body should. The edges of its form seemed to waver, like the shadows were alive, constantly shifting, trying to escape whatever physical laws they had once adhered to. But what terrified me the most weren't its eyes, glowing faintly like the embers of a dying fire. It was the feeling that came with it, the crushing, suffocating fear that seemed to seep from its very being. It's real. I never escaped. My breath caught in my throat as the creature moved again, gliding toward me with slow, deliberate steps. Its presence filled the room, choking the air. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in my panic, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. It was there, right in front of me, and I was trapped in my own home, just as I had been trapped in the cave. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The weight of fear crushed my voice. The creature's face, if you could even call it a face, was a swirling mass of darkness and horror, a twisted mockery of something human with jagged teeth that gleamed like blades. It leaned closer, its breath cold against my skin. And then, in a voice that wasn't a voice but a scraping sound, it whispered my name. I staggered back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. This is it. It's here to finish what it started. The walls of my room felt like they were closing in, just like the caves. The air grew thick, and the floor beneath me seemed to quiver. I tried to force my legs to move, but they refused to obey. In a final, desperate bid, I spun and bolted for the door, throwing it open with all the strength I had left. But when I stepped into the hallway, the world outside my apartment was no longer the world I knew. The walls were shifting, twisting, like I had stepped into a new dimension. The hallway stretched on endlessly in both directions, and the light that had once bathed the apartment in a soft glow now flickered erratically. The shadow that followed me from the living room had somehow expanded into something far worse, a vast, stretching void of darkness, a never-ending night where the creatures could come from any direction. I ran, my breath ragged, my mind spiraling. But no matter how fast I moved, the shadows were always just behind me, just beside me, closing in on all sides. And the whispers were everywhere, filling every inch of the space, crawling into my mind. I reached the stairs, but there was no escape. The building seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, like a living thing, a heart that had stopped beating long ago. I looked over my shoulder, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw the creature in the corner of my eye, a flash of glowing eyes and twisted limbs, waiting to pounce. But then I realized it wasn't behind me. It was inside me. It had been there all along, feeding on the fear I had tried so hard to outrun. I fell to my knees, my body trembling violently as the realization sank in. I could never escape it. Not the caves. Not the creatures. Not the fear. They were a part of me, buried deep within. And now, they had finally caught up. The shadows closed in around me, and I felt their cold embrace. The last thing I heard, before everything went black, was the faintest whisper of my name, followed by the chilling, hollow laugh of something ancient. Something that had never really left. The darkness closed in tighter, swallowing every breath, every thought. I was no longer in my apartment. I was back in the cave, or at least, that's what it felt like. The air was thick with the same oppressive weight I had once known in that endless labyrinth of stone. The walls, the floor, even the air, everything seemed to pulse, to breathe, as if alive. And the fear was suffocating. I should have known. I should have understood it earlier, but I had been too consumed by my own desperate fight for survival. Escape. I thought I could escape. But the truth was cruel, and it slammed into me with all the force of 1,000 hands gripping my throat. The creatures never left. They never followed me into the cave. They were always there, always inside. The cave had just been the beginning. My heart pounded in my chest, and I tried to move, to break free of the invisible chains that bound me. I stumbled forward, but the hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, no longer a place I recognized. It had become an infinite void, a twisting nightmare that my mind couldn't comprehend. The creature's glowing eyes, its twisted form, it had followed me in a way that I couldn't have imagined. It wasn't a presence that could be outrun or escaped. It had already consumed me. I felt the coldness seep into my skin, as though my very bones were becoming part of the darkness around me. It wasn't just the creature that had fed on my fear, it was the fear itself. It had rooted itself in my soul, taking hold of me piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the person I once was. I could hear the whispers again, louder this time, and this time, they were mine. Mine. The voice was no longer foreign, no longer distant. It was my own mind unraveling, my sanity slipping through my fingers like sand. The creature, I could feel it now, was part of me. It wasn't just feeding on my fear anymore, it was shaping it, twisting it, turning it into something darker. And as I stood there, frozen in the labyrinth of my own mind, I realized that I was no longer running. I was the creature. I was the darkness. The walls seemed to tighten, pressing in around me until I could hardly breathe. I could feel my body, my very essence, being consumed. The fear was too much. It had always been too much. The cave hadn't been the prison. The fear was. In the blackness, I tried to scream, but my voice was lost, swallowed by the void. The walls, the shadows, everything became one. My mind fractured as I was pulled into the abyss, consumed entirely. There was no light here, no way out, just the gnawing hunger of something ancient and terrible, something born from the deepest corners of my soul. I had entered the cave seeking answers, seeking knowledge, and I had found them. But the price was more than I could ever repay. The creatures I had seen, they had never been separate from me. They had always been a part of the fear that lived inside me. And now, As I disappeared into the darkness, I understood the terrible truth: there is no escaping fear. It is always with you, inside you. And eventually, it will consume you. The last thing I felt was the weight of the darkness closing around me, and the faintest whisper, my name, echoing forever in the void. And then, there was nothing. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next sinister whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.